A man sits alone in his cell. The walls are concrete, cold, and plain, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights fills the silence. Guards pass by without suspicion, and yet, within hours, he will vanish as if swallowed by the earth itself. This is not the beginning of his story, nor the end, but it is the image that defines Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán to the world, the escape artist who defied governments, who tunneled beneath walls, who became a phantom in the night. To speak of him is to speak of myth and reality intertwined, of a man who rose from the rugged mountains of Mexico to rule an empire that stretched across continents, and who, despite prisons, manhunts, and trials, refused to be contained until the very last moment. His name carries both fear and fascination, whispered in barrios and printed in headlines, a symbol of what power can create and destroy. When people think of El Chapo, they imagine the impossible, the man who walked through shadows and disappeared into tunnels dug with precision and patience. But before the world came to know him as the face of the Sinaloa Cartel, he was simply a boy in a poor village, selling oranges by the roadside, learning early that survival meant outsmarting others. That journey, from a barefoot child in the mountains to one of the most powerful drug lords of modern times, is both extraordinary and unsettling. It is a story woven with ambition, ingenuity, brutality, and the constant pull of escape, not only from prisons but from the weight of poverty, obscurity, and the enemies that stalked him. Imagine lying in the quiet of your bed as this tale begins. Outside, the world still wrestles with the aftermath of his reign, with the tunnels discovered, the violence remembered, and the myths that refuse to fade. For decades, Joaquín Guzmán was more than a man, he was a ghost in motion, his legend growing each time he slipped from the hands of the law. The first escape, hidden in a laundry cart. The second, through a tunnel stretching beneath his prison cell, complete with rails and ventilation. Each time, disbelief echoed across Mexico and far beyond. How could one man, however powerful, outwit entire governments? Yet the truth was simple. El Chapo's genius was not only in building an empire but in building exits. But legends have a way of pulling us in, even when they are born from violence. For some in Mexico, Guzmán became a strange kind of folk figure, a man who had outsmarted corrupt authorities, who poured money into local communities, and who carried himself with the charm of a storyteller. For others, he was nothing but terror, an architect of bloodshed who left countless families broken. And so, when we begin his story tonight, we do not do so to glorify him, nor to diminish the pain he caused, but to understand how a single human being could hold the world in suspense, how a man born into hardship could craft a legend that refused to stay behind bars. Picture the mountains where he came from, the Sierra Madre, vast and rugged, stretching under the burning sun. In those hills, the seeds of opium poppies grew, tended by families who had little else. A boy worked those fields, hardened by hunger, guided by necessity. That boy would one day command billions, but the land of his childhood never left him. The mountains became his fortress, the tunnels his pathways, and the silence of the earth itself his ally. Each escape was not just a trick of clever engineering, but an extension of the landscape he had known since birth. He knew how to vanish into earth and shadow because he had always belonged to them. And so, this story unfolds like a journey through tunnels of its own, winding, hidden, layered with darkness and unexpected turns. You will hear of betrayals, of power wrested and lost, of men who thought themselves untouchable until the earth opened beneath them. You will hear of quiet villages and bustling cities, of mansions with marble floors and cells with concrete walls. Each moment builds upon the other, pulling us forward with the steady rhythm of footsteps echoing in the dark. There is comfort, too, in the telling of stories at night, even stories of men like El Chapo. For in the calm of narration, violence is softened into memory, danger into description, chaos into quiet reflection. The roar of gunfire becomes distant, like a storm long past. The rattle of prison bars is slowed, a faint rhythm against the steady breath of the listener. And within that calm, we can look more closely at the figure who defied so many, not with admiration, but with curiosity. How did he do it? What allowed him to vanish when others could not? Was it luck, brilliance, corruption, or something more? Joaquín Guzmán's life is more than the sum of his escapes. It is a saga of rise and fall, of wealth and ruin, of myth colliding with reality. Yet, it is in the escapes that his legend is sealed. For most criminals, prison is the final chapter. For Guzmán, it was only an intermission. Every capture brought suspense, but every disappearance restored his legend. And in that cycle of capture and escape, of confinement and liberation, the world found itself fascinated, horrified, and endlessly curious. Tonight, as we sink into this long story, we begin at the threshold of myth. A man in a cell. A tunnel waiting beneath. A nation holding its breath. And beyond the bars, beyond the walls, the legend of El Chapo takes shape, not as a hero, not as a villain alone, but as a figure who defied every expectation, who rewrote what it meant to be caged. His life will unfold in shadows and silence, in whispered deals and thundering betrayals. And as you listen, you may find yourself asking not only how he escaped, but why his story continues to escape the finality of an ending. The mountains of Sinaloa stretch wide and endless, their ridges jagged under the Mexican sun, their valleys carved by rivers that glimmer faintly in the distance. Life here is both beautiful and unforgiving. For those born in these remote villages, survival was less about dreams and more about daily endurance. It was here, in the rugged Sierra Madre, that Joaquín Guzmán came into the world. His childhood was not marked by comfort or security, but by the rhythm of poverty, bare feet on dirt paths, the scent of corn tortillas cooking over wood fires, the echo of his father's voice carrying across fields of poppies. This world shaped him long before the world would come to know his name. Guzmán's family lived in a small adobe house, the kind that barely kept out the heat of summer or the chill of mountain nights. His father, Emilio, was a subsistence farmer who also dabbled in cultivating opium poppies. The region had long been a cradle for the drug trade, not because its people sought crime but because the land gave little else. Cornfields often failed, wages were scarce, and opportunities were almost non-existent. For many families, the poppy fields were the only way to survive. Young Joaquín watched this reality unfold every day, learning early that the earth could provide, but it could also demand a cost. He was one of several children, and life in such a household meant that food was never certain. Stories from those who knew him recall a boy who wore the same worn shirt day after day, his sandals falling apart, his eyes restless with both hunger and ambition. Neighbors sometimes called him El Chapo, meaning shorty, a nickname that would follow him throughout his life. It was not meant as cruelty, but rather as an observation. He was shorter than many boys his age, though stocky and strong. He carried himself with a quiet determination that set him apart. By the time he was a teenager, Guzmán had already been sent into the fields to work alongside his father. The labor was grueling hours under the sun, tending to the delicate flowers that would be harvested for opium paste. The air carried the sweet, sharp scent of the poppies, a smell that would linger in his memory. But young Joaquín was not satisfied with this life. Even then, he seemed to sense that survival meant more than toil. It meant learning how to use the land, the people, and the opportunities around him. He began to sell oranges and other fruit by the roadside, developing a small business sense that hinted at something larger. Where others saw poverty, he searched for margins, for ways to climb above the dirt paths of his youth. Despite his hunger for more, his education was minimal. Schooling in these villages often ended by the third grade, and for Guzmán, literacy came slowly and imperfectly. His world was not shaped by books but by conversations, by watching older men barter and negotiate, by listening to stories of traffickers who had made fortunes moving drugs across borders. The myth of the narco-trafficker was already alive in Sinaloa, and for a boy like Joaquín, it shimmered like a faraway promise. These were men who came back to the villages in new trucks, who built houses with tiled floors, who dressed in pressed shirts and cowboy hats. They were proof that there was another life possible, one that poverty did not have to dictate. The mountains of Sinaloa were both a prison and a refuge. On one hand, they isolated families like Guzmán's, cutting them off from opportunity. On the other, they protected those who knew how to use their labyrinthine terrain. For Joaquín, the Sierra Madre became a teacher. He learned its paths, its caves, its shortcuts. He learned how to vanish into the trees and reappear on the other side of a ridge. These lessons in geography would later serve him in ways few could predict, when evading authorities became a matter of life and death. Even as a child, the mountains gave him the gift of invisibility. Yet, invisibility was not enough for him. Those who remember him from those days describe a boy who was not content with silence, who carried an ambition that startled others. He dreamed aloud, telling cousins and friends that one day he would be rich, that one day people would know his name. It seemed impossible then, the words of a hungry boy with little education. But ambition, once planted, does not fade easily. At home, his father's harshness left deep impressions. Emilio was known for drinking heavily and often used his earnings on alcohol rather than the needs of his children. There were nights when the family went to bed with nothing to eat, their bellies aching. This neglect hardened Joaquín, teaching him to rely not on promises but on what he could take or build himself. He developed a stubbornness that made him both resilient and relentless. If something stood in his way, he would push against it until it gave way. As adolescence gave way to young adulthood, Joaquín's work in the fields became intertwined with the larger machinery of the regional drug trade. The Sinaloa countryside was dotted with men who transported marijuana and opium for traffickers. It was not unusual for boys as young as 15 to begin carrying small shipments, walking miles through the mountains to deliver bundles of drugs. Guzmán joined this world almost naturally, blending in with the quiet chain of couriers. But unlike many of his peers, he saw beyond the role of a mule. He was watching, learning, studying how the trade functioned. He wanted to be more than just a worker in someone else's field. Even in these early years, whispers of his determination circulated. He had a reputation for reliability, a rare quality in a dangerous business. If he was told to carry something, he delivered it. If he promised to return with money, he did. This sense of discipline, forged in the hunger of his youth, made him stand out. While many others succumbed to fear or temptation, Guzman built a reputation that would serve as the foundation for his rise. In the end, his childhood was not one of comfort or innocence. It was a crucible that molded him into someone who valued survival above all, who saw ambition not as a luxury but as a necessity. The mountains gave him resilience, poverty gave him hunger, and the drug trade gave him a path. By the time he left the world of simple farm work behind, Joaquín Guzmán was no longer just a poor boy from Sinaloa. He was a young man with the first glimmers of a plan, a man who had already decided that the world would one day know his name. The air in the Sierra Madre was thin and sharp, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and earth. By the time Joaquín Guzmán reached his teenage years, he had already tasted the bitterness of poverty, the grind of farm work, and the harsh lessons of survival. Yet, something in him refused to settle. While many of his peers resigned themselves to the same cycles of hardship their parents had endured, Guzmán's eyes were fixed beyond the mountains. He knew there was another world out there, a world of money, influence, and power, and he intended to reach it. His first real steps into the trade would be small, almost invisible to outsiders, but each one marked a path toward the empire he would one day build. In those days, the drug trade in Sinaloa was like a shadow that touched every family. Marijuana fields thrived in hidden clearings, while opium poppies dotted the hillsides with their colorful, deceptive beauty. Boys were often recruited as couriers, carrying small bundles on foot or by mule across dangerous mountain trails. Joaquín joined these ranks as naturally as if he had been born into it, because in truth, he had. His father had already been part of the trade in small ways, and young Guzmán simply stepped into the current that flowed all around him. But unlike most who carried loads in silence, Joaquín was paying close attention. He noticed who controlled the shipments, who held the respect of others, and who made the real money. He began to understand that the trade was not just about transporting drugs, it was about logistics, timing, and trust. One mistake could cost lives, but efficiency and loyalty could open doors. At first, he was just another teenage boy trudging through the mountains with a bundle on his back, but little by little, he began to cultivate a reputation for reliability. In a business where betrayal was common, such a reputation was more valuable than gold. Joaquín also revealed a stubborn streak that set him apart. If he was cheated in a deal, he did not let it go. Neighbors recalled that as a boy, when someone failed to pay him for fruit he had sold, he locked the man's front gate until the debt was settled. This same relentlessness carried over into his early trafficking activities. If he was given a shipment, he ensured it reached its destination. If payment was promised, he made sure it was collected. Others noticed this determination, and word spread quietly through the hills: the short, stocky boy called El Chapo could be trusted. But the trade was not only about discipline, it was also about imagination. Joaquín had a gift for seeing possibilities where others saw obstacles. He began experimenting with ways to move drugs more efficiently. Instead of relying only on long, exhausting treks through the mountains, he sought out vehicles, animals, and eventually routes that cut travel time. His mind worked constantly, always searching for an advantage. These early innovations may have been modest, but they foreshadowed the tunnels, planes, and elaborate systems that would later define his empire. By his late teens, Guzmán was already making connections beyond his village. He came into contact with traffickers linked to larger operations, men who would one day become household names in Mexico's underworld. These figures were impressed by his energy and his hunger. They saw in him a young man who did not complain, who asked questions, and who delivered results. Slowly, Joaquín began to move from the periphery of the trade toward its inner circles. He was no longer just a courier, he was becoming a participant in a growing network. Still, life remained precarious. Violence was never far away, and the risk of arrest loomed over every deal. Joaquín learned to stay alert, to notice when strangers appeared in the village, to listen for the sounds of engines that did not belong. He developed the habit of disappearing into the hills at the first sign of danger, vanishing into the terrain that had raised him. The mountains were his refuge, teaching him that survival often depended on knowing when to appear and when to disappear. This instinct would serve him time and again in the decades to come. As his involvement deepened, Guzmán also began to see the darker realities of the trade. He witnessed violence firsthand, disputes settled not with words but with bullets. He saw what happened to those who failed, who betrayed, or who crossed the wrong man. Fear was ever present, but it did not deter him. If anything, it seemed to sharpen his resolve. Perhaps poverty had already hardened him to fear, or perhaps ambition burned too brightly within him to be extinguished. Whatever the reason, Joaquín pressed forward, undeterred by the blood that occasionally stained the path. At home, his family noticed changes. The boy who once struggled to put food on the table was now contributing in ways that seemed impossible just years before. He brought in money, small at first but growing steadily. He could afford clothes, small luxuries, even help for relatives. This shift gave him a taste of power to change not only his own life but the lives of those around him. For someone who had grown up with little, this was intoxicating. It reinforced his belief that ambition and cunning could bend the world to his will. The broader context of Mexico in these years also played a role. Corruption ran deep, and traffickers often found ways to operate under the watchful but complicit eyes of local officials. Guzmán learned early that money could smooth paths, open gates, and silence questions. He began to see bribery not as a crime but as a tool, as essential as any weapon or shipment. This understanding would later grow into one of his greatest strengths, enabling him to build a network of protection that stretched from local police to high-ranking politicians. By the time he was in his early 20s, Joaquín Guzmán had already shed the image of a simple farm boy. He had entered a world where trust and betrayal danced closely, where fortunes rose and fell overnight, and where survival demanded both ruthlessness and vision. He was not yet a kingpin, not yet the feared and legendary El Chapo, but the foundation had been laid. Every deal completed, every connection made, every lesson learned was a brick in the empire he would one day command. His story, even then, was not about sudden leaps but about steady steps. Each decision pushed him forward. Each risk taken brought him closer to power. The boy from Sinaloa's mountains was transforming into something else entirely, a man who could see beyond the horizon, a man who was willing to take whatever path necessary to escape the limitations of his birth. And as night fell over the Sierra Madre, with its winding trails and silent valleys, Joaquín Guzmán carried with him the first sparks of a fire that would one day blaze across the world. The air in Mexico during the late 1970s and early 1980s was thick with change. The drug trade was no longer a scattered collection of farmers and small-time smugglers, it was transforming into a highly organized, ruthless, and global industry. Young Joaquín Guzmán was caught right in the middle of this transformation. He had already proven himself in the hills of Sinaloa, a boy turned reliable courier, a man with ambition burning in his chest. But ambition alone would not carry him forward. To rise, he needed mentors, allies, and opportunities. And in the turbulent years that followed, Guzmán would find all three. At this point, Mexico's trafficking world was dominated by powerful figures like Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the godfather of the Guadalajara cartel. Gallardo and his associates controlled enormous portions of the drug flow from South America into the United States. Their empire stretched from Colombia's jungles to the busy streets of Tijuana and Juarez. For a young man like Guzmán, stepping into Gallardo's orbit was like standing before a giant. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and full of possibility. Joaquín began by working under seasoned traffickers connected to Gallardo. His early reputation as El Rapido, the one who moved shipments quickly and efficiently, spread among the network. He was not just a mule anymore. He was proving himself as someone who could handle logistics with remarkable precision. Others took weeks to move shipments. Guzmán shaved that down to days, sometimes hours, using carefully chosen routes, bribed officials, and an obsessive attention to timing. In a business where one mistake could cost millions of dollars, this efficiency made him invaluable. It was during these years that Guzmán's personality began to sharpen into the paradox the world would come to know. On one hand, calm and even charming, able to smile and talk easily; on the other, utterly ruthless when challenged. He could joke with workers, pay peasants fairly for their help, and then, with the same steady voice, order brutal consequences for anyone who crossed him. Violence, to him, was not personal, it was a tool, a message, a necessary cost of doing business. Stories began to circulate of the way Guzmán handled disobedience. If someone failed to deliver a shipment or tried to cheat him, punishment was swift. He reportedly used public displays of discipline, men tied to trees, beatings carried out in front of others, to instill fear and loyalty at the same time. These methods were brutal, but they worked. In an environment where betrayal was common, Guzmán built a reputation for control. He became the kind of man others did not want to disappoint, not only because of the rewards he offered but because of the consequences he guaranteed. Yet alongside this violence, there was also a deep practicality. Guzmán was not reckless. He measured his moves carefully, always balancing risk against reward. He understood that power in the drug trade was not only about guns and men, it was about logistics, relationships, and keeping product moving across borders. His attention to detail made him stand out, especially to men like Felix Gallardo, who valued order and results above all. By the early 1980s, Guzmán had risen high enough to oversee significant shipments for the Guadalajara cartel. He coordinated convoys of vehicles, each carefully arranged so that if one was intercepted, the others could still pass through. He developed strategies for smuggling through airports, highways, and remote border crossings. Every successful operation brought him more trust, more money, and more influence. Slowly, the boy from the mountains was transforming into a figure of consequence, someone whose name carried weight in the cartel world. This was also the time when Guzmán began cultivating his own network of loyal men. He recruited drivers, couriers, and enforcers, often pulling them from the same poor villages he had come from. He knew that men from backgrounds like his were both loyal and desperate. They understood hunger, and they would be grateful for steady pay. To them, Guzman was both a leader and an opportunity. He gave them work, food, and protection. In return, they gave him loyalty that ran deeper than fear alone. The young trafficker also began to show signs of the ingenuity that would later define him. When authorities increased patrols on highways, he shifted to hidden airstrips carved into the mountains. When police checkpoints became too common, he devised new routes through dirt roads and mule paths that authorities would not think to watch. Each obstacle became a puzzle for him to solve, and each solution reinforced his reputation as someone who was not only ruthless but clever. Still, this rise was not without danger. Rival factions existed within the cartel, each led by ambitious men who resented newcomers like Guzman. Violence simmered beneath the surface, and alliances shifted constantly. Guzman had to navigate this dangerous landscape with care, aligning himself with the right mentors while avoiding fatal mistakes. He learned that in the world of organized crime, loyalty was fragile, and survival depended on staying indispensable. At the same time, Guzman's wealth began to grow. Though not yet at the level he would later reach, he started to enjoy luxuries unknown in his childhood. He bought new vehicles, fine clothes, and jewelry. He provided money for his family back in Sinaloa, lifting them from poverty into relative comfort. This display of wealth was not just personal indulgence, it was a signal to others. It showed that he was climbing, that he was no longer just another trafficker but a man on his way to becoming something greater. What made Guzman's rise especially striking was the speed at which it happened. In less than a decade, he had gone from selling fruit by the roadside to coordinating multimillion-dollar shipments for some of the most powerful men in Mexico. He had done this not by accident, but by relentless determination, a willingness to use both charm and violence, and an ability to see opportunities others overlooked. Yet, beneath the surface of this rise, danger loomed. The Guadalajara cartel itself was fragile, held together by the leadership of Felix Gallardo but threatened by internal divisions and increasing pressure from U.S. authorities. For Guzman, this fragility represented both risk and opportunity. If the empire fractured, he could be crushed beneath its collapse, or he could step into the gaps and claim power for himself. The years ahead would test him in ways even he could not yet imagine. In these formative years, the essential outlines of El Chapo were drawn: the boy who became a man with an iron will, the trafficker who built loyalty through both fear and generosity, the strategist who saw not just the present but the possibilities of the future. The mountains had given him resilience. Poverty had given him hunger. And now, under the shadow of Mexico's drug lords, Guzman was sharpening into the man who would one day command the Sinaloa Cartel. The world had not yet learned his name, but those in the trade already knew. The short man from Sinaloa was someone to watch, someone who would not be satisfied with merely serving others. His rise was only beginning. The collapse of the Guadalajara cartel in the late 1980s marked one of the most dramatic turning points in the history of organized crime in Mexico. For Joaquín Guzmán, it was a moment of both peril and promise. The empire he had helped sustain was cracking apart, its leaders arrested or hunted, its foundations weakened by betrayal and pressure from U.S. and Mexican authorities alike. Yet for men with vision, chaos is not only destruction, it is also opportunity. This was the storm in which Guzman would begin shaping the foundations of what would become the most powerful cartel Mexico had ever seen, the Sinaloa Cartel. The downfall began with the kidnapping and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985, a crime that sent shockwaves through international politics. The United States demanded justice, and the Mexican government, long complicit in turning a blind eye to cartel operations, was forced into action. Raids, arrests, and assassinations followed, striking at the heart of the Guadalajara cartel. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, El Padrino, the cartel's unifying figure, was arrested in 1989. With his removal, the delicate balance of power shattered. The once unified trafficking empire split into warring factions, each controlled by ambitious men eager to claim their share. For Guzman, this was both dangerous and promising. He had been loyal to Gallardo, proving himself as a trusted lieutenant who could move shipments with speed and precision. But with Gallardo gone, no central figure remained to dictate order. Guzman recognized what many others failed to see. This was the moment to step forward, not hide. He could either be consumed by the chaos or seize it as a ladder to climb higher. He aligned himself with Hector El Guerro Palma, another rising trafficker from Sinaloa, and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a man whose discretion and intelligence made him invaluable. Together, they formed the seeds of what would soon be known as the Sinaloa Cartel. Unlike the older structures of Guadalajara, which relied heavily on central authority, the Sinaloa network was designed to be flexible. Each leader had autonomy, but together they created a powerful alliance that controlled key routes across the country. The decision to base their operations in Sinaloa was no accident. The rugged mountains and isolated villages that had raised Guzman were also perfect for hiding airstrips, labs, and convoys. The region's people, many of whom had long depended on cultivating marijuana or opium poppies to survive, became the backbone of this new organization. To them, Guzman was not merely a boss, he was one of their own, a man who had risen from the same soil, who understood their struggles, and who could offer them steady pay in a world where government aid never reached. But building a cartel in the ashes of Guadalajara required more than loyalty from poor farmers. Guzman and his partners needed to control smuggling routes to the United States, the plazas. These routes were the arteries of the drug trade, and every trafficker knew that whoever controlled them controlled wealth and power. Conflict was inevitable. The Sinaloa group clashed with rivals in Tijuana, Juarez, and later the Beltran Leyva brothers. Violence spilled into the streets, turning cities into battlegrounds. Guzman distinguished himself in these wars not by sheer brutality alone but by his mastery of logistics. While others relied on intimidation, he refined smuggling into an art form. One of his most famous innovations was the use of tunnels. Engineers under his orders began constructing elaborate passageways beneath the U.S.-Mexico border, complete with lighting and ventilation systems. These tunnels allowed drugs to flow north unseen, avoiding checkpoints and patrols. It was a bold, audacious idea, and it worked. The tunnels became one of Guzman's trademarks, a symbol of his cunning and his willingness to outthink rather than simply outfight. At the same time, he diversified transportation. Drugs moved not only through tunnels but also hidden in trucks, concealed within shipments of produce, and flown in small aircraft to remote airstrips. He cultivated relationships with Colombian cartels, ensuring a steady flow of cocaine into Mexico. His reputation as El Rapido grew even larger, not only in Mexico but across Latin America. Colombian traffickers preferred dealing with Guzman because he guaranteed efficiency. While others lost shipments to police or rivals, Guzman delivered. Yet Guzman was not just a trafficker, he was becoming a strategist. He understood that to maintain control, he needed to offer both fear and favor. In the regions under his influence, he often acted like a benefactor. He built schools, funded churches, and handed out money to the poor. Entire villages came to see him as a protector, even a kind of folk hero. To them, the government was distant and corrupt, while Guzman provided tangible help. This Robin Hood image was carefully cultivated, softening his brutality and ensuring silence when authorities came asking questions. But Guzman's generosity had limits. Those who threatened his business faced swift and merciless punishment. Stories of his ruthlessness spread widely, rivals executed, traitors disappeared, whole families targeted to send a message. Fear traveled faster than his money ever could. This combination, fear to suppress enemies, generosity to secure loyalty, became the dual pillars of his power. By the early 1990s, the Sinaloa Cartel had established itself as one of the dominant forces in Mexico. Guzman had transitioned from being a trusted lieutenant in someone else's empire to a leader of his own. His organization controlled significant trafficking routes, forged alliances with Colombian suppliers, and wielded influence in politics and law enforcement through a web of bribes. He was no longer just Joaquín Guzmán from the hills of La Tuna, he was El Chapo, a name whispered with equal parts fear and admiration. Still, with power came new enemies. The Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel resented Sinaloa's growing reach. The Juarez cartel, under Indio Carrillo Fuentes, known as the Lord of the Skies, also stood as a formidable rival. These confrontations would spark bloody wars that engulfed Mexico for decades. But even as bullets flew, Guzman's position only solidified. He had turned the fall of Guadalajara into the rise of Sinaloa, proving himself not just a survivor but a visionary. In retrospect, this period marks the true birth of El Chapo as a kingpin. The traits that defined his rule, innovation, ruthlessness, charisma, and adaptability, were all sharpened during these years. He learned to balance terror with loyalty, violence with generosity, secrecy with spectacle. More importantly, he learned that survival in the world of cartels was not about avoiding enemies but about staying indispensable, always a step ahead. By the time the dust of the Guadalajara cartel's collapse had settled, Guzman was no longer a supporting player in someone else's story. He was writing his own chapter, one that would eventually make him the most notorious drug lord of his generation. The short man from Sinaloa had not only survived the storm, he had harnessed it to build an empire. The 1990s ushered in a new chapter in Joaquín Guzmán's story, one defined not by growth alone, but by survival through fire. By this time, the Sinaloa cartel had become a force to be reckoned with, securing key trafficking routes and establishing Guzmán as a rising figure among Mexico's underworld. Yet success in this world always attracted danger. For every dollar earned, a rival sharpened his blade, for every ally gained, a betrayal waited in the shadows. El Chapo was about to enter a decade where his power would be tested against enemies both outside and within, where violence became not just a tool but a language, and where his cunning would prove as vital as his muscle. One of the most explosive rivalries of the era was with the Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel. The border city of Tijuana was one of the most lucrative plazas in Mexico, a gateway into California where billions of dollars in narcotics could be funneled. For the Arellano Felix brothers, Benjamin, Ramon, Eduardo, and their siblings, this was their stronghold, and they guarded it with a paranoia sharpened by both cruelty and ambition. Guzman's desire to expand Sinaloa's influence inevitably brought him into direct conflict with them. The battles between the two cartels were not quite affairs carried out in shadows. They were spectacles of violence that spilled into the streets, shocking a public that was already weary of corruption and bloodshed. One of the most infamous moments occurred in 1993, when a shootout at the Guadalajara airport turned into a national tragedy. Gunmen sent to assassinate Guzman mistakenly shot and killed Cardinal Juan Jesus Posdas Ocampo, a revered religious figure. The death of a cardinal sent Mexico into chaos, unleashing political outrage and international scrutiny. While Guzman was believed to have been the intended target, the event only amplified his notoriety. To the public, he was no longer just another trafficker, he was the face of a growing crisis that stained even the sacred. The Arellano Felix brothers were relentless in their pursuit of Guzman. Stories circulated of ambushes, kidnappings, and torture carried out by their men. Ramon Arellano Felix, in particular, was known for his savage methods, often personally leading attacks. Guzman, however, was not easily cornered. He had learned from the mountains of Sinaloa that survival meant knowing when to vanish and when to strike. His network of safe houses, loyal lieutenants, and hidden routes made him difficult to pin down. Again and again, he slipped through their grasp, earning a reputation as a man who could defy death as easily as he defied the law. But while the war with Tijuana dominated headlines, Guzman also faced challenges within his own ranks. Cartel alliances were notoriously fragile, and betrayals were as common as friendships. Rumors of disloyalty, defections, and secret deals haunted every leader. To maintain authority, Guzman relied on both loyalty and fear. He rewarded those who stood by him but made brutal examples of those who betrayed him. Entire families sometimes paid the price for one man's treachery, a strategy designed to leave no doubt about the cost of betrayal. Amid the violence, Guzman's operations grew ever more sophisticated. His tunnels under the U.S.-Mexico border became legends in themselves, marvels of ingenuity that allowed massive shipments of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin to flow north with little interference. Trucks loaded with produce concealed drugs beneath crates of jalapenos or avocados, while corrupt officials ensured safe passage through checkpoints. Guzman's genius was not only in moving drugs, but in creating redundancy. If one method failed, another succeeded. His empire became a machine with many moving parts, each designed to outwit the authorities. What set him apart from many rivals, however, was his ability to shape perception. In Sinaloa, he was not merely a trafficker but a benefactor. He paid for fiestas, repaired roads, and supported churches. Families who received envelopes of cash spoke of him with gratitude, even reverence. The myth of El Chapo as a Robin Hood figure began to take hold, a narrative that softened his brutality in the eyes of those who benefited from his generosity. In regions abandoned by the state, Guzman's word carried more weight than the law itself. Still, beneath the surface of his generosity was paranoia. He knew that wealth and power painted a target on his back. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, armored vehicles, and safe houses outfitted with escape tunnels. He avoided routines, never sleeping in the same place twice, never traveling without layers of protection. Even his closest allies were kept at arm's length, their loyalty constantly tested. In Guzman's world, trust was a luxury he could never fully afford. The violence of the 1990s reached a fever pitch as cartels fought openly for dominance. Kidnappings became common, executions were left on public display, and entire communities were caught in the crossfire. Guzman, despite his cunning, could not remain invisible forever. In 1993, after the airport shootout and the rising pressure from both Mexican and U.S. authorities, the net began to close around him. For the first time, his myth of invincibility would be challenged not by rivals but by the law itself. Yet even as the decade darkened with bloodshed, Guzman's legend grew. To his enemies, he was a phantom who could not be caught. To his allies, he was a leader who brought wealth and protection. To the world at large, he became the symbol of Mexico's war against drugs, a man whose name alone conjured both fear and fascination. The battles of the 1990s did not destroy him, they forged him into a figure larger than life, a man who seemed to thrive in chaos, always one step ahead of death. By the end of the decade, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was no longer just a trafficker from Sinaloa. He was a warlord, a myth, and a survivor of some of the bloodiest conflicts in cartel history. But even as he stood at the height of his power, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. His enemies had not forgotten him, and now, neither had the governments of Mexico and the United States. The walls were closing in, and Guzman would soon face a trial unlike any he had yet endured, the trial of captivity. The year was 1993, and for Joaquín Guzmán, the walls that had so long felt distant were finally beginning to close in. After years of outmaneuvering rivals, bribing officials, and slipping through the cracks of Mexico's fragile justice system, El Chapo would soon face something he had always feared but prepared for: endlessly capture. His arrest marked the end of an era of unchecked mobility, but it also revealed something else about him, that even behind bars, Guzman's power was not so easily contained. The events leading up to his capture were as chaotic as the decade itself. After the infamous shootout at the Guadalajara airport in May 1993, the botched assassination attempt that left Cardinal Juan Jesus Postdas Ocampo dead, Guzmán became the most wanted man in Mexico. The killing of such a prominent religious figure ignited international outrage. For the Mexican government, long accused of complacency in the face of cartel violence, it was an embarrassment too large to ignore. Pressure from the United States intensified, demanding swift action against those responsible. And though Guzmán was not directly blamed for the cardinal's death, he was seen as a central figure in the escalating violence. The state needed a trophy, and El Chapo was it. The hunt for him intensified. He fled from safe house to safe house, moving constantly, never lingering in one place long enough to be cornered. But even the most elusive fugitives make mistakes. On 9th June 1993, in Guatemala, Guzmán's luck ran out. Authorities there, working with Mexican officials, intercepted him near the border. Accounts suggest he was found traveling in a vehicle convoy, his security detail unable to shield him from the sudden operation. When the news broke, it shocked Mexico. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the untouchable, the phantom of the mountains, was finally in custody. His arrest was portrayed as a major victory in the war on drugs. Cameras flashed, newspapers ran his image, and government officials spoke proudly of dismantling one of Mexico's most notorious criminals. But beneath the surface, the reality was more complicated. Guzmán's empire did not collapse with his capture. The Sinaloa Cartel, structured as a federation rather than a monarchy, adapted. Allies like Ismael El Mayo Zambada and Hector El Guerro Palma continued operations, ensuring that business went on largely uninterrupted. El Chapo may have been behind bars, but his influence still flowed outward, like a river redirected but never dried up. Guzman was transferred to the high-security prison at Almoloya de Juarez, later known as Altiplano. This facility was designed to hold Mexico's most dangerous criminals, men whose reach was thought to extend far beyond prison walls. For Guzman, prison was not a place of surrender, it was simply a new battlefield. From the moment he arrived, he began testing the system, probing for weaknesses, and building networks among guards and inmates alike. Inmates and former officials would later describe how Guzman managed to live with privileges few others could imagine. He had food brought in, access to visitors, and communication channels that allowed him to continue directing cartel operations from within. His wealth ensured that guards could be bribed, and his reputation meant that fellow prisoners treated him with deference. Even in chains, he cultivated loyalty and fear. The myth of his invincibility only grew stronger. If El Chapo could run a cartel from inside a prison, then perhaps he truly was beyond the reach of the law. Still, life in prison was not without its humiliations. Guzman, a man used to the open landscapes of Sinaloa and the constant movement of his smuggling operations, found confinement stifling. Surveillance cameras watched him, guards shadowed him, and walls pressed in where once mountains had stretched wide. For a man who had built his life on freedom of movement, captivity was its own kind of death. He paced endlessly, restless, always thinking of escape. And always, escape was in his mind. Those who knew him understood that Guzman was never resigned to staying locked away. He studied the routines of guards, memorized the architecture of his surroundings, and kept his eyes fixed on opportunities. He knew that money could open doors where force could not, and he had no shortage of wealth. To him, prison was less a punishment and more an obstacle, a problem to be solved with time, patience, and strategy. Beyond the prison walls, the war between cartels raged on. The Arellano Felix brothers tightened their grip on Tijuana, while the Juarez cartel, led by MDU Carrillo Fuentes, grew in power. Violence escalated, cities trembled under the weight of kidnappings and executions, and ordinary people lived in fear of stray bullets. Even behind bars, Guzman remained a player in this chessboard of blood. He sent orders through coded messages, relayed through visitors or bribed officials, ensuring that the Sinaloa cartel remained competitive. To many of his men, his imprisonment was temporary, merely a pause before he returned to lead them directly again. The Mexican government, for its part, heralded his capture as proof of progress in the war on drugs. Yet whispers of corruption undermined the official narrative. Too many guards were too friendly, too many privileges too visible. It seemed less like a triumph of justice and more like a holding period, a pause in the life of a man who was never meant to stay behind bars. For the Mexican public, Guzman's arrest was a mixture of relief and disbelief. Some saw it as long overdue justice, a moment when the state finally proved capable of striking at the heart of organized crime. Others, especially in Sinaloa, mourned his capture, viewing him not as a criminal but as a benefactor whose money and influence had brought prosperity to poor communities. In the mountains where he was born, his name was spoken with a mix of respect and sadness, as though a local hero had fallen into the hands of outsiders. Inside the prison walls, Guzman waited. He played the role of prisoner, but in his mind, the game was far from over. He knew that the government celebrated his downfall, but he also knew that walls were never as strong as they seemed. Every man has a price, and every system has a weakness. All he needed was patience. For now, the world believed Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán had been caged. But history would show that cages were never meant to hold him. His first capture was not the end of his story, it was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one where his legend would grow even larger. Because from the moment the prison doors shut behind him, El Chapo was already planning how to open them again. Prison, for most men, is a place where time slows to a crawl, where days blur into nights and freedom becomes a distant memory. But for Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, incarceration was not the end of his empire, it was simply a change of scenery. From the moment he was processed into Almoloya de Juarez, the high-security prison later renamed Altiplano, he carried himself less like a defeated criminal and more like a man taking stock of a new battlefield. The bars, walls, and watchtowers might have confined his body, but they could not confine his will, his money, or his reach. Inside those concrete walls, Guzmán began to shape a strange existence, half prisoner, half kingpin. Guards, whose salaries were meager compared to the riches the cartel could provide, soon learned that their loyalty could be purchased. A nod here, an envelope there, and the lines between jailer and accomplice blurred. Visitors brought news from the outside world, messages hidden in folded papers or disguised as casual conversation. Sometimes, officials themselves acted as couriers, delivering instructions in exchange for bribes so large they could buy silence for years. The government had captured El Chapo, but they had not tamed him. His daily life was a curious blend of restriction and privilege. On paper, he was subjected to the strict routines of a high-security inmate, monitored movements, limited contact, constant surveillance. Yet behind the rigid schedule, Guzmán carved out small freedoms. He had access to better food than most prisoners, often smuggled in from outside. He received regular visits, not only from family but also from associates who acted as intermediaries for cartel business. Inmates reported that he carried himself with authority, that even hardened criminals showed him deference. In a world where survival often depended on alliances, El Chapo stood above them all. Still, even for a man of his stature, prison life gnawed at him. Freedom had always been his most prized possession. From the mountains of Sinaloa to the tunnels beneath the border, his entire life had been defined by movement, by the ability to vanish and reappear at will. Confinement stripped him of that. He was watched at all times, confined to a cell whose walls pressed in on him, stripped of the open skies he had grown up under. Those who visited him often remarked on his restlessness, his constant pacing, his eyes always calculating, always looking for cracks in the system. To Guzmán, a locked door was never a permanent obstacle, it was simply a puzzle waiting to be solved. Even behind bars, Guzmán remained a central figure in Mexico's drug war. His associates outside ensured the Sinaloa Cartel remained one of the most powerful trafficking organizations in the world. Colombian suppliers continued to funnel cocaine through Sinaloa's networks, while rival cartels clashed violently over territory. Orders traced back to Guzmán himself, passed through coded messages and trusted emissaries. The prison walls had done nothing to dim the cartel's operations. If anything, his imprisonment elevated his legend, proof to many that even in captivity, he was untouchable. Among the people of Sinaloa, Guzmán's myth as a folk hero grew stronger. Stories circulated of how he continued to provide for his home communities, funding repairs, supporting families, and ensuring that his reach stretched even from within a cell. In towns where government aid was scarce, the people saw little difference between El Chapo in the mountains and El Chapo in prison. To them, he was still their protector, their benefactor, their Robin Hood. The government may have locked him away, but they could not erase the loyalty of those who lived under his shadow. The authorities, however, celebrated his capture as a victory in their war on drugs. Official statements painted the picture of a state reclaiming control, of law finally triumphing over lawlessness. Yet whispers persisted of corruption within the prison itself. Too many guards looked the other way, too many privileges slipped through unnoticed. It became increasingly clear that Guzman's incarceration was not the neat victory the government claimed. Instead, it was a fragile arrangement, one where a single misstep could tilt the balance back in Guzman's favor. But even with his influence, prison carried dangers of its own. Rival factions wanted him dead, and his notoriety made him a target. Guzman responded the way he always had by surrounding himself with layers of protection. Bribes ensured guards remained loyal, while his reputation alone discouraged would-be attackers. Few dared to challenge him directly, for they knew that even if they struck within the prison, consequences would rain down from outside. To cross El Chapo was to invite destruction not only upon oneself, but upon one's family. His reach was long, and everyone knew it. Yet, for all his control, Guzman never grew comfortable behind bars. He understood that the longer he remained in prison, the more vulnerable he became. The government, under increasing international pressure, could tighten its grip at any moment. Rivals outside could seize the opportunity to weaken Sinaloa's influence. And time, relentless as ever, threatened to erode his aura of invincibility. For a man who had built his legend on escape, the thought of remaining locked up indefinitely was unthinkable. So, he began to plan. Patiently, methodically, he studied every detail of the prison. He watched the guards, noting their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. He built a network of loyalists inside, ensuring that information flowed to him. Money moved silently, opening doors, silencing questions, and securing cooperation. Guzman was not content to endure prison life. He was determined to master it, to turn it into the staging ground for his eventual return to freedom. The world outside believed that Joaquín Guzmán had been caged. But inside those walls, he was already constructing the outlines of his next move. Each day in confinement only deepened his resolve, only sharpened his focus. For El Chapo, prison was not an ending, it was a pause. And with every step he took across the concrete floor of his cell, every whisper exchanged with a bribed guard, every coded message sent beyond the prison gates, he was drawing closer to the day when those walls would crumble before him. Life in prison had changed him, but not in the way the government hoped. It did not break his spirit, nor did it cripple his empire. Instead, it reinforced the one lesson he had learned since childhood in the mountains of Sinaloa: nothing is permanent. Not poverty, not weakness, not even prison. For Guzman, the cell was only temporary. Escape was inevitable. And with that belief, he waited, calm and patient, knowing the world would soon hear his name again. The year was 2001, and the world was about to witness one of the most audacious prison escapes in modern history. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán had spent years inside the high-security walls of Puente Grande Prison, a facility built to hold Mexico's most dangerous criminals. It was a place designed to suffocate freedom, a place where iron bars, concrete walls, and layers of armed guards were meant to extinguish hope. But for Guzmán, Puente Grande was not a tomb. It was a waiting room. Every day he spent locked up was a day spent studying the rhythms of the prison, a day spent planting seeds of influence, and a day spent rehearsing in his mind the art of disappearing once again. Prison life, for Guzmán, was never just about survival. It was about strategy. He had turned guards into allies with money, and money into loyalty with promises. Slowly, he built a network within Puente Grande, a hidden web of corruption that reached from the lowest kitchen worker to the highest-ranking prison official. Cigarettes were traded for favors, envelopes of cash exchanged for silence. Guzmán knew the cost of freedom was not measured in force or violence, it was measured in pesos, in bribes, in the subtle art of persuasion. For years, he lived under the watchful eyes of the authorities. His movements were restricted, his conversations monitored, his visitors scrutinized. Yet, beneath the surface of control, Guzmán wove an invisible safety net. Guards who were supposed to keep him locked away instead ensured he lived with privileges, extra food, special visits, privacy when needed. The more trust he gained, the looser the prison's grip became. Over time, he was no longer just an inmate, he was the hidden master of Puente Grande. And when he finally decided it was time to leave, the stage was already set. The details of that January night in 2001 remain legendary. Official records say Guzmán escaped hidden inside a laundry cart, an ordinary, metal box used to wheel out dirty clothes from the prison. But to call it a simple escape would be an insult to the planning it required. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It was the culmination of years of manipulation, careful observation, and the slow bending of rules until the walls themselves seemed to conspire with him. The story goes that a trusted prison worker wheeled Guzmán's body, curled inside the cart, through a series of checkpoints. Each guard along the way had a choice: follow the rules or follow the money. One by one, they chose the latter. The cart rolled past locked doors, down hallways echoing with silence, past surveillance points that suddenly looked the other way. Some guards later claimed ignorance, insisting they had no idea Guzmán was inside. Others admitted what everyone suspected, that the Sinaloa Cartel's reach was far longer than any prison corridor. By the time the cart reached the prison's outer edge, Guzmán was closer to freedom than anyone had imagined possible. Outside, a vehicle waited, arranged with precision and secrecy. In minutes, the man who had been Mexico's most famous prisoner slipped out of Puente Grande and into the night, leaving behind only whispers and disbelief. The prison's walls, so proudly built to keep men like him inside, had failed. Mexico awoke to the news not of Guzmán's capture, but of his escape, and the legend of El Chapo grew even larger. For the government, it was a humiliation of staggering proportions. Officials scrambled to explain how the most watched, most guarded inmate in the nation had vanished in a laundry cart. Some tried to downplay the corruption, insisting Guzmán's escape was a singular failure rather than a systemic one. But the truth was impossible to hide. Puente Grande was rotten from the inside out, and Guzmán had exploited every crack in its foundation. The world laughed at the Mexican authorities, but within the Sinaloa Cartel, the escape was celebrated as proof that El Chapo was untouchable. On the outside, Guzmán wasted no time reclaiming his empire. He returned to the mountains of Sinaloa, welcomed by loyalists who saw him not as a fugitive, but as a king returned to his throne. His enemies, stunned by his audacity, found themselves once again forced to reckon with his power. The government's victory, which they had paraded in his 1993 capture, evaporated overnight. In the streets, in the bars, in the villages where corridos, folk songs, sang of his legend, El Chapo was no longer just a trafficker. He was a myth, a man who could not be contained. The escape marked a turning point in the drug war. With Guzmán free, the Sinaloa Cartel surged to new heights of dominance. Cocaine and heroin flowed northward across the border with renewed force, and his enemies, the Arellano Felix brothers of Tijuana, the Carrillo Fuentes clan of Juarez, faced a reinvigorated rival. The escape was not just a personal triumph, it was a declaration to the world that no prison, no matter how fortified, could hold him. In the years that followed, investigators pieced together the layers of corruption that had enabled Guzmán's escape. Dozens of guards and officials were implicated. Some were arrested, others quietly dismissed, many simply disappeared. But the truth remained, El Chapo had not escaped alone. He had walked out with the help of a system built on greed and fear, a system where loyalty was always for sale. And as long as that system remained, so too did the possibility that Guzmán would always find his way back to freedom. For El Chapo himself, the escape was more than freedom, it was rebirth. He emerged from prison not weakened but stronger, his reputation polished into something almost supernatural. To his enemies, he was more dangerous than ever. To his allies, he was a living symbol of resilience. And to the people of Sinaloa, he was the man who had once again beaten the government, the man who defied the impossible and won. The image of him being wheeled out in a laundry cart became a story repeated in hushed tones, in songs sung late into the night, in the laughter of those who admired his audacity. Some mocked it as absurd, others admired its genius. But in every retelling, the same message echoed: El Chapo was a man who could not be held. That January night in 2001, Puente Grande lost a prisoner, but Mexico gained a legend. And from that moment forward, every time the government announced his capture, the world would ask the same question: how long before he escapes again? After slipping out of Puente Grande in 2001, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán did not simply disappear into the shadows. He re-emerged like a ghost reborn, stronger, more powerful, and more determined than ever to extend the reach of the Sinaloa Cartel. To the Mexican government, his escape was an embarrassment, to his rivals, it was a nightmare. And for El Chapo himself, it was a second chance to rebuild his empire and cement his status as one of the most formidable crime lords in history. The mountains of Sinaloa were waiting for him. Remote, rugged, and filled with people who had long benefited from his influence, they provided the perfect sanctuary. Villagers whispered of his return with both fear and admiration. To some, he was the benefactor who paid for schools, medicines, and food. To others, he was the outlaw who defied the government and made lawlessness seem like freedom. In the cool nights of the Sierra Madre, corridos were written in his honor, songs that celebrated his daring escape and his relentless rise. From this base of loyalty and secrecy, Guzmán began orchestrating the next phase of the cartel's growth. His strategy was as ruthless as it was calculated. He saw the drug trade not just as smuggling but as an industry, one that could be streamlined, expanded, and perfected. Under his leadership, the Sinaloa Cartel began to function like a corporation, with routes, logistics, and territories managed with precision. Drugs flowed north toward the United States, while money and weapons returned south, fueling a cycle of power that seemed unstoppable. But this expansion was not without cost. Rival cartels were not blind to his movements. The Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel, still nursing wounds from past clashes, vowed to stop him. The Juarez cartel, once dominant in northern Mexico, fought fiercely to maintain control of key smuggling corridors. Blood spilled in the streets as Guzman's forces battled for dominance, leaving entire neighborhoods gripped by violence. Each confrontation added to his legend. Stories of convoys of armored vehicles, assassins armed with military-grade weapons, and shootouts that turned cities into war zones. At the same time, Guzman demonstrated a rare kind of foresight. Where others relied only on brute force, he also embraced innovation. He diversified smuggling methods, digging sophisticated tunnels beneath the U.S. Mexico border, tunnels so advanced they included ventilation systems, electricity, and rail tracks to move drugs quickly and discreetly. These tunnels became infamous symbols of his ingenuity, evidence that for every barrier, Guzman would always find or build a way around it. He also expanded the cartel's reach globally. Alliances were formed with Colombian suppliers, ensuring a steady flow of cocaine. Networks spread across Central America, through ports and hidden airstrips. El Chapo was no longer just a Mexican drug lord. He was becoming a global kingpin, his influence stretching across continents. And yet, even as his empire grew, he never abandoned the roots that tied him to the mountains of Sinaloa. In those hills, where his people sheltered him and his money protected them, he remained untouchable. But with power came paranoia. Every betrayal was punished swiftly, often brutally. Guzman's world was one where loyalty was rewarded with wealth, but disobedience was answered with death. Rivals who underestimated him found themselves hunted, their families targeted, their strongholds reduced to ashes. The cartel wars escalated into levels of violence that shocked even seasoned investigators. Bodies hung from bridges, mass graves filled the countryside, and fear spread like wildfire through Mexico's border towns. For many, the name El Chapo was no longer just associated with smuggling, it was synonymous with terror. Yet, for his followers, his myth grew. In the eyes of many poor communities, he was still the man who brought prosperity where the government had brought neglect. He provided jobs, funded public works, and played the role of a Robin Hood figure despite the violence that surrounded his empire. This duality, terrorist to some, hero to others, kept his legend alive. He was both feared and admired, a man who seemed to exist above the law and beyond consequence. The Mexican government, pressured by the United States, vowed to capture him again. But Guzman's escape had left deep scars in the system. Corruption ran so high that every attempt to corner him was thwarted. Information leaked, raids failed, and safe houses were abandoned just minutes before authorities arrived. It seemed as though he had eyes everywhere, as if the mountains themselves whispered secrets to him. Every time the government promised his downfall, he slipped through their fingers, and with each escape, his myth hardened into something almost supernatural. By the mid-2000s, El Chapo's reign as a fugitive was complete. The Sinaloa Cartel had eclipsed its rivals, becoming the most powerful drug trafficking organization in Mexico. Its reach extended far beyond smuggling routes. It had infiltrated politics, police forces, and even the military. Guzman himself remained elusive, rarely photographed, his whereabouts always uncertain. To the authorities, he was a ghost. To the streets, he was a legend sung about in ballads, celebrated in whispers, and feared in silence. And yet, despite his dominance, the seeds of downfall were already being sown. His ambition, his desire to control everything, and his reliance on a fragile web of corruption made him vulnerable. The same brilliance that had allowed him to escape Puent Grand and expand the cartel would eventually draw the full weight of the law back onto him. But in these years, those first golden years of his return, El Chapo Guzmán ruled as a fugitive king, a man who had walked out of prison and into a throne built on fear, loyalty, and the endless flow of power that came from drugs. For the moment, his legend seemed untouchable. The man in the laundry cart had become a global figure, a shadow stretching across borders, a myth too powerful to contain. But as history has shown time and again, even legends have cracks, and the higher one rises, the more perilous the fall becomes. By the mid-2000s, the legend of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán had grown into something larger than life. He was not just a fugitive drug lord, he was a ghost in the mountains, a man who seemed to slip through every net cast around him. For the Mexican government, his 2001 escape was a wound that had never healed, a humiliation replayed every time his name was spoken. For the United States, watching drug shipments surge across the border, he was the embodiment of failure in the so-called war on drugs. And so, the hunt resumed, this time with greater urgency, greater resources, and a determination that felt almost personal. The Mexican authorities, under pressure from Washington, vowed to bring El Chapo back into custody. Military convoys rolled through northern states, helicopters scanned mountain ridges, and intelligence units pieced together scraps of information from informants, phone intercepts, and captured rivals. Yet, time and again, raids ended in frustration. A farmhouse would be stormed only to find it empty. A convoy of cartel trucks would vanish into the desert, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks. Guzmán always seemed to be a step ahead, as though he could hear the government's plans before they were spoken. This uncanny ability to evade capture was no accident. El Chapo had built an intricate network of lookouts and informants, stretching across entire towns. In villages loyal to him, children would ride bicycles with radios reporting the movement of soldiers. Farmers and shopkeepers would send warnings whenever unfamiliar vehicles appeared. The mountains of Sinaloa acted as both shield and sanctuary, a natural fortress where every winding road and hidden path favored the fugitive king. Whenever the army advanced, the locals became his early warning system, and by the time helicopters landed or trucks rumbled into town, El Chapo was already gone. There were moments when the authorities came close, painfully close. Intelligence agencies sometimes tracked his phone calls, but Guzmán was cautious. He spoke briefly, changed numbers often, and relied on messengers instead of modern devices. Still, one careless moment, a call to a loved one, a brief lapse in caution would give away his location. Raids were launched in places like Durango and Sinaloa, but each time, he escaped by minutes, sometimes even seconds. Soldiers would find half-eaten meals on the table, fresh footprints in the dirt, or still warm beds in abandoned safe houses. The frustration only deepened his legend. The United States intensified its involvement. The DEA, FBI, and other agencies worked hand in hand with Mexican counterparts, offering intelligence, surveillance technology, and funding. But even with international cooperation, El Chapo seemed untouchable. His network was too vast, his influence too deep. Corruption, the unseen weapon in his arsenal, ensured that many operations were doomed from the start. It was not uncommon for military commanders to leak raid plans or for local police to tip off cartel members. In a system where loyalty was often measured in bribes, Guzman's wealth kept him one step ahead of justice. Yet, living as a fugitive came with its own costs. Though he commanded armies of sicarios, traffickers, and lieutenants, El Chapo himself moved cautiously, always hidden, always guarded. His safe houses were equipped with secret tunnels and escape hatches, designed for the moments when raids came to close. He traveled lightly, sometimes disguised, often surrounded by trusted bodyguards who would rather die than surrender him. Nights were restless, days unpredictable. For all his wealth and power, his life was lived in shadows, haunted by the knowledge that capture was always a heartbeat away. The manhunt became a symbol of Mexico's struggle. Politicians promised results, presidents declared victories in the war on cartels, but as long as El Chapo roamed free, those victories rang hollow. Every failed raid, every close call, every whisper of his presence somewhere in the mountains only deepened the sense that the state was fighting a phantom it could not touch. In the streets, people joked that Guzman was more powerful than the government itself. In the mountains, his myth grew as a man who could not be caught, a man who walked through fire and emerged untouched. Still, the government pressed on. The years after 2001 were marked by escalating violence, with cartels battling one another and the military fighting all sides. Amid this chaos, Guzman not only survived but thrived. His cartel expanded, his rivals weakened, and his wealth grew to staggering levels. Yet, the noose tightened, slowly but surely. Technology advanced. Satellites traced movements that once went unnoticed. Informants grew bolder, some lured by rewards too large to resist. And though Guzman seemed invincible, the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. Close calls piled up like storm clouds on the horizon. There were nights when helicopters hovered above his hideouts, when soldiers surrounded towns only for him to slip away through a tunnel or a hidden path. Each escape added to the government's shame, but also revealed how narrow the margins of survival had become. He was no longer the untouchable king who had vanished in a laundry cart. He was a hunted man, cornered in his own empire, relying on the loyalty of others to keep the chase at bay. The hunt for El Chapo was not just about capturing a fugitive, it became a battle of wills, a contest between a state desperate to reclaim its authority and a man determined never to kneel. Every raid, every rumor, every close encounter added another chapter to the story. And though the authorities failed again and again, they did not relent. The shadow of his capture loomed ever closer, a reminder that even the most elusive legends could not run forever. In those years, as soldiers combed mountains and agents traced phone signals, El Chapo's myth grew even larger. He was both everywhere and nowhere, a fugitive king ruling from the shadows. And yet, deep inside, even he must have known that the walls were closing in, that every escape only brought him closer to the moment when the chase would end not with a disappearance, but with the cold weight of iron bars. The morning of 22nd February 2014 dawned like any other in Mazatlan, a quiet seaside city in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. Families rose to the sound of waves breaking along the shore, fishermen prepared their boats, and the humid air clung to the palm trees swaying in the breeze. Yet behind the calm, a storm of years-long planning and international cooperation was about to reach its climax. On this morning, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the world's most wanted drug lord, would finally be captured after more than a decade on the run. For years leading up to that day, The net had been tightening. After his legendary 2001 escape from Puente Grande prison, Guzmán had returned to power, expanding the Sinaloa Cartel into a global enterprise. But the United States, frustrated by his uncanny ability to evade justice, increased the pressure on Mexico to act. Intelligence agencies tracked cartel communications, mapped trafficking routes, and analyzed the movements of Guzmán's inner circle. Every phone call, every courier, every whispered conversation became a potential clue. Slowly, painstakingly, a picture emerged, not of a myth, but of a man. The search gained momentum in early 2014 when authorities traced Guzmán's network of safe houses. These residences, scattered across Sinaloa, were connected by an extraordinary feature: secret tunnels beneath bathtubs, built as escape routes. Soldiers would raid one house, only to find a tunnel leading to another. Each time, El Chapo slipped away like smoke through cracks in the earth. The raids grew more frequent, and though they ended in frustration, they also revealed how close authorities were getting. The myth of his untouchability began to fray. Then came the breakthrough. Intelligence pointed to Mazatlan, a coastal city known more for tourism than cartel hideouts. It was there, inside a modest condominium tower, that Guzmán was believed to be hiding with his wife, Emma Coronel, and their young daughters. Unlike the heavily fortified mountain compounds he usually relied on, this safe house was ordinary, almost inconspicuous. Perhaps Guzmán felt that blending into the everyday life of a bustling city was safer than hiding in plain sight. Perhaps he believed the authorities would never look for him in a seaside apartment. Whatever his reasoning, it would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. In the early hours of that February morning, Mexican Marines, guided by intelligence from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and the U.S. Marshals Service, surrounded the building. The operation was quiet, precise, and executed with discipline. Soldiers moved swiftly up the stairwells, their boots silent against the tile floors. The air was thick with anticipation, every step carrying the weight of years of failed attempts. This time, there were no tunnels beneath the bathtub, no secret passageways carved into the earth. This time, there was nowhere to run. When the Marines burst into the apartment, they found Guzmán asleep. The man who had once commanded armies of killers, who had escaped prisons, tunneled beneath borders, and defied governments, was caught in the most human of states, vulnerable, unconscious, unaware. He woke to the sight of rifles aimed at him, his empire collapsing in the silence of a single room. No bullets were fired, no daring escape was made. After more than 13 years as a fugitive, the most wanted man in the world was captured without resistance. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, headlines screamed across the globe, El Chapo captured. In Mexico, relief mingled with disbelief. Could it really be true? Had the phantom finally been caught? For the government, it was a moment of triumph. Photographs of Guzmán in custody, flanked by masked Marines, were broadcast worldwide, a symbol of Mexico reclaiming its authority after years of humiliation. For the United States, it was proof that relentless pursuit and international cooperation could succeed even against the most elusive of targets. Yet for all the celebration, questions lingered. Could Mexico keep him this time? Memories of Puente Grande haunted the victory, reminders that Guzmán had slipped through iron bars before. Officials promised tighter security, stronger measures, and an unbreakable commitment to prevent another escape. He was transported to Altiplano, one of Mexico's highest security prisons, a place designed to contain even the most dangerous of inmates. Authorities assured the world that the mistakes of 2001 would not be repeated. In the streets of Mexico, reactions were divided. Some cheered his capture, seeing it as a long overdue step toward justice. Others mourned, not for the man himself but for the protection and support he had offered in impoverished communities. In the corridors sug across the countryside, El Chapo was still the folk hero who had outsmarted the government, the Robin Hood figure who spread wealth in forgotten towns. His capture only added to his legend, a story of rise, escape, power, and eventual downfall. For Guzmán himself, the capture was both an end and a pause. Stripped of his freedom, locked once more behind steel and stone, he faced a future uncertain and fragile. His empire would continue without him, his lieutenants, his networks, his wealth, but his absence left a void. The man who had once seemed invincible was now just another prisoner, his power reduced to memories and myths. Yet beneath the surface of celebration, one question lingered like a shadow over the victory: was this truly the end of El Chapo's story, or merely another chapter in a tale of escapes and returns? As the world watched him marched before cameras, handcuffed and subdued, the irony was impossible to miss. For years, he had lived as a ghost, uncatchable, a man who could vanish in the blink of an eye. And yet, in the end, it was sleep, not violence, not betrayal, not a gunfight that brought him down. The fugitive king had been dethroned not in a blaze of bullets but in the quiet stillness of dawn. The capture of 2014 was more than the fall of a man, it was a symbol of the ongoing struggle between power and law, between myth and reality. For a brief moment, it seemed the chase was over, the legend contained. But those who knew El Chapo's story understood that legends rarely end so simply. The world held its breath, waiting to see if this time the bars would hold. In the months that followed his 2014 capture, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán found himself locked away inside the walls of Altiplano, Mexico's highest security prison. To the outside world, this seemed like the end of the story. Politicians and officials declared victory, insisting that this time there would be no escape, no lapses, no humiliation like the one Mexico had suffered in 2001 when Guzmán vanished from Puente Grande. But the reality inside Altiplano was more complex. A man like El Chapo did not simply disappear into a cell. He carried with him the weight of an empire, the loyalty of soldiers, the wealth of billions, and the paranoia of someone who knew the world had not stopped moving just because he was behind bars. Altiplano was no ordinary prison. It was built to hold the most dangerous criminals, a fortress of steel and concrete. Cells were small, windowless, and soundproof. Surveillance cameras followed inmates' every movement. Guards rotated constantly to avoid corruption, and prisoners were transferred between cells at random intervals to prevent routines. Guzmán was placed under extreme restrictions. He was monitored around the clock, his communications strictly controlled, his interactions limited. Every time he was moved, even for something as small as a medical check, the corridors were cleared and heavily armed guards stood watch. On paper, it was an environment designed to crush even the most powerful of inmates. Yet power, for someone like El Chapo, was never entirely stripped away. His cartel continued to operate beyond the prison walls, run by trusted lieutenants and family members. Drug shipments still moved across borders. Money still flowed. In many communities across Mexico, the cartel's influence remained strong and Guzmán's name still carried weight. Inside the prison, whispers spread that guards could be bought, that even in a place like Altiplano, loyalty could be bent with enough cash. Though officials tried to project an image of control, the reality was that Guzman's reach extended far beyond the bars of his cell. But power did not mean comfort. Prison life brought with it a gnawing sense of vulnerability. Guzman had enemies everywhere, rival cartels, government officials, even those within his own organization who saw an opportunity to rise in his absence. Every meal he ate, every interaction with a guard, every locked door reinforced the same thought, that betrayal or assassination could come at any moment. Reports later suggested he grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that his food could be poisoned or that guards might stage an accident. He trusted almost no one, and the walls that held him also seemed to close in on his mind. Still, Guzman's legend was not erased. In Sinaloa, songs continued to be written about him. Corridos played in cantinas, celebrating his cunning, his escapes, his larger-than-life persona. For some, his imprisonment only enhanced the myth. Here was the man who had outsmarted the government for decades, the man who had walked through tunnels and out of prisons. If anyone could escape Altiplano, it would be El Chapo. This belief was not just folklore, it was a dangerous reality, one that officials tried to dismiss but could not entirely silence. His family also remained a presence. Emma Coronel, his young wife, visited him regularly, often accompanied by their twin daughters. To the public, these visits painted a strange picture, the feared cartel boss reduced to a father, speaking softly with his children across a sterile prison table. For Guzman, it was both a comfort and a reminder of what he stood to lose. Behind bars, stripped of the trappings of wealth and power, he was left with only human ties. Those visits were perhaps the only moments when the myth gave way to the man. Meanwhile, outside, the Sinaloa Cartel faced challenges. Rivals like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, pushed aggressively into territories once firmly controlled by Guzman's organization. Violence erupted across Mexico as factions fought for dominance. For the cartel's leadership, keeping Guzman's influence alive was both a necessity and a burden. His name carried fear, but his absence created instability. Rumors circulated constantly that he still gave orders from prison, that coded messages slipped through the walls, that loyalists within the prison staff carried his words to the outside world. Whether true or not, these stories kept his image alive, both terrifying and inspiring those who heard them. Inside Altiplano, time moved slowly. Days blurred together under fluorescent lights. The silence of isolation became suffocating. Guzman, a man used to moving constantly, managing operations, making decisions, and living in luxury, now found himself reduced to the monotony of a cell. That restlessness fed his paranoia but also his determination. If his mind wandered, it wandered not toward surrender, but toward possibility. Somewhere, somehow, an escape plan was already being conceived. The Mexican government, eager to prove they could contain him, paraded his imprisonment as a national victory. They showed the world a subdued Guzman, his head bowed, his hands cuffed, surrounded by Marines. Yet behind the show of strength, cracks remained. The same corruption that had plagued Mexico for decades still lingered in shadows. And El Chapo, even in silence, understood one truth better than anyone: every system has a weakness, every wall has a crack, and every prison has a way out. This was the paradox of Guzman's second imprisonment. On the surface, it was the triumph of law over crime, the final capture of a fugitive myth. But beneath that surface, it was something far more fragile. The man behind bars still commanded loyalty, still inspired fear, and still carried within him the unshakable belief that no cage could ever truly hold him. To his followers, his incarceration was only temporary, a pause in a story that would inevitably continue. And to Guzman himself, locked inside Altiplano, surrounded by guards and cameras, there was only one thought that mattered: if he had escaped once, he could escape again. The night of 11th July 2015 seemed ordinary within the walls of Altiplano prison. Guards carried out their routines, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán sat alone in his cell. But beneath that surface of stillness, something extraordinary was unfolding, something that would once again place Mexico in the global spotlight. By dawn, El Chapo would be gone, vanished as if into thin air, and the legend of his escapes would grow to mythical proportions. What no one knew in that moment was that a tunnel, meticulously planned and engineered over the course of many months, had already been carved beneath the prison floor, waiting like a secret passage into freedom. The tunnel was not a crude passageway hacked out in desperation. It was an engineering marvel, stretching over a mile long, equipped with ventilation systems, electricity, and even a modified motorcycle mounted on rails to move materials and speed up travel. At one end was Guzman's shower stall inside Altiplano, at the other, a half-built house in the nearby countryside, constructed for the sole purpose of concealing the exit. The precision and ambition of the project spoke volumes about the reach and resources of the Sinaloa Cartel. It wasn't simply an escape, it was a statement to the world that no wall, no prison, and no government could contain their leader. That evening, Guzmán was last seen on security cameras entering the shower area of his cell. Guards, accustomed to his routines, paid little attention. Minutes passed, and when he did not re-emerge, suspicion grew. A guard checked the cell and found it empty. The impossible had happened, El Chapo was gone. What followed was panic. Sirens blared, searches began, and the prison descended into chaos. Soldiers and police swarmed the facility, but by then it was far too late. Guzmán had disappeared into the labyrinth beneath their feet. As details emerged, the scale of the operation stunned the world. Reports revealed that the tunnel measured approximately 1.5 kilometers and was nearly 30 feet underground. Workers had labored tirelessly for months, if not years, coordinating logistics with astonishing precision. Soil had been removed discreetly, equipment smuggled in, and noise masked. The house at the tunnel's exit had been purchased and built under false pretense, blending seamlessly into the rural landscape. Everything had been orchestrated with one purpose in mind: to free Guzmán from the supposedly inescapable prison. For the Mexican government, the escape was more than a humiliation, it was a disaster. Just 1 year earlier, officials had celebrated Guzmán's capture as proof of progress in the war on drugs. Now, in a single night, that narrative collapsed. The public reacted with outrage and disbelief. How could a man escape from the nation's most secure prison not once, but twice? Was it incompetence or corruption at the highest levels? Questions swirled, and with them came a deepening mistrust in the government's ability to enforce justice. On the streets of Sinaloa, however, the story played differently. For Guzmán's supporters, the escape was cause for celebration, a symbol of defiance against the state. Corridors were written overnight, celebrating his ingenuity and resilience. Videos spread online of fireworks being set off in villages, crowds chanting his name, and ordinary people expressing admiration for the man who had once again slipped through the fingers of authority. In these communities, where the cartel's influence ran deep, Guzman's escape wasn't just a news story, it was proof of his almost supernatural ability to outwit the system. Internationally, the news dominated headlines. Governments across the world criticized Mexico's handling of Guzman, while U.S. officials renewed calls for his extradition. The escape highlighted the vast networks of corruption and influence that allowed such an operation to succeed. It wasn't simply a matter of a hole in the ground, it was evidence of the cartel's power to infiltrate institutions, to recruit engineers, to pay off officials, and to carry out one of the most daring prison breaks in modern history. For Guzman himself, the escape was both liberation and a return to danger. Freedom came with a price. The moment he emerged from that tunnel, he was once again the most wanted man in the world. The Mexican government launched a nationwide manhunt, deploying thousands of soldiers and police. International agencies, including the DEA, intensified their efforts to track him down. Yet in the mountains of Sinaloa, Guzman found refuge, protected by loyalists and shielded by terrain that had always been his sanctuary. The escape also reignited tensions within the cartel. Power struggles simmered as lieutenants jockeyed for influence during Guzman's absence. His dramatic return to freedom unsettled rivals and allies alike. Some saw him as invincible, while others worried his notoriety would bring even greater pressure on the organization. The balance of power in Mexico's underworld shifted once more, with Guzman at the center of the storm. In the months that followed, officials released footage of the moments leading up to the escape, grainy black and white video showing Guzman pacing in his cell before disappearing behind the shower wall. For many, the footage became symbolic, a haunting reminder of the state's vulnerability. The image of an empty cell, its door ajar, echoed far beyond Mexico. It was a metaphor for the larger struggle against organized crime, a reminder that no victory was ever secure, and that men like Guzman thrived in the spaces between law and corruption. Ultimately, the 2015 escape cemented El Chapo's place in history. He was no longer just a drug lord. He was an outlaw folk hero, a man who had humiliated two governments and defied the notion of confinement. The tunnel became part of his legend, recounted in songs, documentaries, and whispered conversations. It was proof of his resourcefulness, his wealth, and his enduring grip on both the criminal underworld and the public imagination. Yet for Guzman, the escape was only temporary. The freedom he tasted in 2015 would not last. His newfound visibility, his myth, and the relentless pursuit of both the Mexican and U.S. governments meant that the clock was ticking. For now, though, as he emerged from that tunnel into the cool night air of the countryside, El Chapo was once again untouchable. The man who had walked through walls had done it again, leaving behind only an empty cell, a hole in the ground, and a world stunned by the audacity of his defiance. In the wake of El Chapo's breathtaking 2015 escape, Mexico erupted into chaos. The government, already embarrassed on the global stage, launched what became one of the largest manhunts in modern history. Thousands of soldiers, federal police, and intelligence agents were deployed across the country. Roadblocks appeared overnight, helicopters hovered above highways, and military convoys rolled through towns near Sinaloa. The official message was clear: Guzman would not humiliate the state a second time. But beneath that official story, in the rugged mountains of northwestern Mexico, a very different reality was unfolding. Guzman knew the Sierra Madre like the lines on his hands. These mountains, vast and unforgiving, had been his sanctuary since his earliest days as a smuggler. Their dense forests, winding trails, and hidden valleys provided natural cover that no amount of technology could easily penetrate. To outsiders, the mountains were treacherous, but for Guzman, they were home. He had safe houses carved into cliff sides, tunnels linking one property to another, and entire villages that owed their survival to his cartel's influence. In this terrain, he was not merely hiding, he was thriving. The manhunt, however, was relentless. Intelligence agencies traced phone calls, monitored satellite signals, and sent drones buzzing over the wilderness. American agencies like the DEA and U.S. Marshals added pressure, feeding information to Mexican authorities. Guzman's family and associates were monitored closely. His wife, Emma Coronel, and his sons, known collectively as Los Chapitos, became subjects of constant surveillance. The government believed that following the people closest to him might lead to his capture. Yet Guzman, ever cautious, moved like a shadow, never staying in one place for long, never using a phone for more than a few seconds, and always relying on loyal couriers to pass messages. Still, the fugitive life was far from glamorous. Guzman could no longer move openly through cities or enjoy the luxuries he once flaunted. Every day brought new risks. Helicopters scarred the skies above his mountain refuges, and military patrols advanced deeper into his strongholds. To evade them, Guzman relied on an extensive network of tunnels and hidden escape routes. Some safe houses were designed with trapdoors that led to underground passages, allowing him to vanish in moments if soldiers closed in. Others were booby-trapped or reinforced with steel doors to delay raids. His survival depended on preparation, paranoia, and the loyalty of those who sheltered him. But loyalty, in a world built on fear and money, was fragile. The longer Guzman remained free, the more his presence strained the Sinaloa Cartel. Allies who once celebrated his escape began to worry. His notoriety drew unwanted attention, intensifying the government's crackdown on cartel operations. Rivals like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, took advantage of the chaos, seizing territories and pushing into regions once dominated by Sinaloa. Even within his own organization, whispers of discontent grew louder. Some believed it was time for El Chapo to step aside and let the younger generation lead. Others plotted quietly, calculating how his capture or death might serve their interests. Meanwhile, the government turned to more aggressive tactics. They raided homes in Culiacan, stormed ranches in Durango, and combed through mountain villages. Each operation ended the same way: empty rooms, discarded belongings, and trails gone cold. In some raids, they found evidence that Guzman had been there only hours earlier: still warm meals on a table, a rumpled bed, or discarded medicine. It was as though he had vanished just before the soldiers arrived, always one step ahead, always slipping through their fingers. This uncanny ability to evade capture deepened his myth, painting him as untouchable. But even legends can falter. During one raid in the mountains, Guzman injured his leg while fleeing through rough terrain. Though the injury was not life-threatening, it slowed him down and made movement riskier. Authorities seized on the rumor, believing his weakened condition might make him easier to corner. For Guzman, the injury was a reminder of his mortality. No matter how many tunnels he built or how many loyalists he commanded, time and chance remained his greatest enemies. Adding to the danger was his own yearning for connection. Isolated in the mountains, Guzmán longed to see his wife and daughters, to maintain some semblance of family life. Against the advice of some of his men, he arranged secret meetings, often in rented homes in cities like Culiacan and Los Mochis. These moments, while humanizing, also left him exposed. Every visit created a trail of phone calls, movements, and contacts that authorities could trace. His desire for normalcy clashed with the cold discipline required to remain invisible. The manhunt grew increasingly tense as the months wore on. Each raid brought the promise of capture, each escape deepened the humiliation of the state. In press conferences, Mexican officials vowed they were closing in, yet Guzmán's legend only expanded. Songs glorifying his evasion spread, videos of his supporters celebrating surfaced online, and whispers of his whereabouts fueled endless speculation. Was he hiding in a mountain cave? Traveling in disguise through rural towns? Or living comfortably in a luxurious safe house, laughing at the soldiers who hunted him? Behind the myth, though, Guzmán's world was shrinking. Every movement required secrecy, every decision carried enormous risk. His once unshakable power now seemed fragile, dependent on luck as much as loyalty. The pressure was mounting, not only from the government but from the shifting dynamics of the cartel world. Rivals encroached, allies questioned his leadership, and U.S. agencies pressed Mexico to deliver results. The mountains that had once been his kingdom were now a cage of a different kind. Yes, they protected him from immediate capture, but they also trapped him in a cycle of constant vigilance, unable to rest, unable to return to the life of power he once commanded so openly. Each day on the run was a day closer to betrayal, discovery, or exhaustion. And though the world still saw him as invincible, the cracks in the myth were beginning to show. The manhunt for El Chapo was more than a pursuit of one man, it was a battle between myth and reality, between the illusion of untouchability and the inevitability of downfall. For now, Guzmán remained at large, a ghost haunting the mountains, slipping through tunnels and disappearing into shadows. But as the world would soon see, even ghosts cannot run forever. The early hours of 8 January 2016 would mark the end of one of the most audacious manhunts in modern history. For months, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán had played a dangerous game of hide-and-seek with Mexican and U.S. authorities. He had slipped through mountain passes, vanished into tunnels, and emerged in unexpected places, always one step ahead of capture. But on that morning, in the coastal city of Los Mochis, the legend of invincibility that had defined him for decades would finally fracture. The city itself was unassuming, a working-class port town in the state of Sinaloa, not far from Guzmán's birthplace. Its streets were narrow, its neighborhoods dotted with modest homes and shops. To the untrained eye, there was nothing extraordinary about Los Mochis. Yet in the weeks leading up to January, the city had become the center of intense surveillance. Mexican Marines, aided by U.S. intelligence, had been tracking whispers of Guzmán's movements. A safe house in a quiet neighborhood had drawn their attention, a modest two-story house that looked no different from its neighbors but carried the subtle signs of a fortified hideout. Inside that house, Guzmán was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Reports later revealed that he had been meeting associates, entertaining visitors, and even considering plans to produce a film about his life, a project that would lead him into a fateful meeting with actress Kate Del Castillo and Hollywood star Sean Penn. These encounters, meant to shape his legacy, also left traces, calls, messages, and contacts that gave authorities the clues they needed. On the night of 7th January, a team of Mexican Marines prepared to move. These were not ordinary soldiers, they were part of Mexico's most elite unit, trained for high-risk operations. Backed by intelligence from the DEA and the U.S. Marshals Service, they surrounded the safe house before dawn. The streets were silent, the cool night air heavy with anticipation. Every detail of the operation had been planned meticulously, but those involved knew the danger they faced. El Chapo was armed, surrounded by loyal gunmen, and desperate men fight hardest when cornered. At around 4:30 a.m., the Marines launched their assault. Explosions shattered the pre-dawn silence, followed by bursts of gunfire that echoed through the neighborhood. Inside, Guzman's men scrambled to defend him, unleashing a hail of bullets. Neighbors awoke in terror as the battle raged, the sound of automatic weapons rattling windows and shaking walls. The Marines pressed forward with precision, storming room by room. Blood pooled in the corridors, and the safe house quickly became a battlefield. Despite the chaos, Guzman remained calm. He had faced raids before and knew escape was always possible. As his men exchanged fire with the Marines, Guzman and his lieutenant slipped through a hidden passage beneath the house. The tunnel led them to the city's sewer system, a dark, foul maze of pipes and passages. Wading through the filth, Guzman tried once again to vanish into the underworld that had so often saved him. For a time, it seemed he might succeed. But fate had turned. The Marines, already familiar with his escape tactics, quickly secured the tunnel exits. Guzman and his lieutenant emerged into the streets of Los Mochis, soaked and desperate, and commandeered a stolen vehicle. For a brief moment, freedom seemed within reach. They sped through the city, trying to blend into the dawn traffic. But checkpoints had already been established, and within hours, the world's most wanted fugitive was cornered once again. When the Marines finally stopped the vehicle, Guzman did not resist. Perhaps he knew the game was over, or perhaps he understood that another violent confrontation would only end in death. Drenched, exhausted, and defeated, he was taken into custody. The image of El Chapo disheveled, escorted by masked soldiers, his headboard flashed across television screens worldwide. The man who had once seemed untouchable now appeared mortal, diminished, and human. For the Mexican government, the capture was a moment of redemption. President Enrique Peña Nieto, whose administration had been ridiculed after Guzman's 2015 escape, quickly declared victory. Mission accomplished, he tweeted, echoing words often associated with premature triumphs. But this time, the victory felt decisive. Guzman was back in custody, and officials were determined not to repeat their earlier mistakes. Yet behind the celebration, there lingered an unspoken recognition. El Chapo's capture had been made possible not only by military strength but also by his own ambition. His desire to tell his story, to meet with actors and journalists, had exposed him. His myth, carefully constructed over decades, had led to the very carelessness that brought about his downfall. In Sinaloa, reactions were mixed. Some mourned his capture, lamenting the loss of a man seen by many as a benefactor who had provided jobs, protection, and a strange kind of justice in regions neglected by the state. Others, weary of the violence his reign had unleashed, saw his arrest as a moment of relief. Across Mexico, the news sparked debate: was this truly the end of El Chapo's era, or would his cartel continue without him? The international community reacted with cautious optimism. U.S. officials immediately pressed for extradition, arguing that Guzmán's presence in Mexico had proven too unstable and that only an American prison could truly contain him. Mexican authorities resisted at first, insisting they could hold him. But privately, many acknowledged the truth. El Chapo's history of escapes had shattered public confidence, and keeping him in Mexico would always carry risk. In that moment, though, all that mattered was that he had been caught. The photographs of his capture became iconic. Guzmán seated on a bed, wearing a dirty undershirt, his eyes weary, his expression unreadable. Another image showed him being marched through the airport by armed marines, his once feared figure reduced to that of a prisoner. These images traveled the world, signaling the end of his freedom and the beginning of a new chapter in his story. For Guzmán himself, the capture was both defeat and inevitability. He had evaded justice for decades, escaped twice from supposedly impenetrable prisons, and commanded one of the most powerful criminal organizations on earth. Yet every empire, no matter how vast, eventually cracks under its own weight. That morning in Los Mochis, the myth of invincibility ended not with a triumphant battle or a grand betrayal, but with a tired man pulled from a car, out of options, and surrounded by soldiers. The world would not stop watching him after Los Mochis. If anything, the drama of his capture only fueled the next act of his story, the long fight over his extradition, his trial in the United States, and the final question of whether El Chapo's legend would outlast the man himself. But on that morning, as the sun rose over Los Mochis, the chase was over. The escape artist who had humiliated governments had finally run out of tunnels. When Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was returned to Altiplano prison after his capture in Los Mochis, the air around his confinement felt different. The Mexican government, bruised by two humiliating escapes, knew that keeping him locked away indefinitely was both a necessity and a liability. On paper, El Chapo was once again behind bars, silenced and controlled. In reality, his presence in Mexico was a ticking bomb, one that threatened to explode with corruption, violence, or another daring breakout. The question no longer was whether he could be contained in Mexico, but whether the country could risk keeping him at all. The United States had been pressing for Guzmán's extradition for years. American prosecutors had built cases in multiple districts, New York, Texas, Illinois, California, and Florida, each accusing him of crimes ranging from drug trafficking and money laundering to murder. To U.S. officials, Guzmán wasn't just Mexico's problem, he was a global menace, responsible for flooding American streets with narcotics and fueling an epidemic of addiction and violence. They argued that only a U.S. supermax prison could guarantee his permanent imprisonment. Mexico, however, had resisted these demands in the past. Extraditing Guzmán was politically sensitive. For some, it was a matter of national pride, proof that Mexico could deliver justice without relying on its northern neighbor. Others worried that sending him abroad would expose the depth of corruption that had allowed him to thrive. Yet his 2015 escape had changed everything. Confidence in Mexico's ability to hold him had collapsed, and public opinion leaned toward handing him over. Inside Altiplano, Guzmán lived under suffocating conditions. Determined to prevent another escape, authorities imposed unprecedented restrictions. His cell was reinforced with steel, cameras monitored him from every angle, and guards were rotated frequently to prevent familiarity. Even his sleep was disturbed, as lights flickered on and off at irregular intervals to ensure he could not slip into darkness unnoticed. Each move he made was tracked, documented, and controlled. To El Chapo, it felt less like imprisonment and more like psychological warfare, a deliberate effort to break him from within. These harsh measures took their toll. Reports suggested Guzman's health deteriorated in prison. He complained of headaches, memory loss, and depression. His lawyers argued that the conditions were inhumane, designed to torture rather than confine. They fought extradition fiercely, filing appeals and motions that dragged the process out. To them, extradition was not just a legal transfer, it was the end of their client's world. In Mexico, Guzman had power, connections, and influence. In the United States, he would have none. Outside the prison, his legal battle unfolded against a backdrop of political maneuvering. The Peña Nieto administration faced mounting pressure to show progress in the war on drugs. The United States, frustrated with decades of failed cooperation, demanded results. Each court hearing, each legal argument, became a stage on which Mexico's credibility was tested. Would the government risk another embarrassment by keeping Guzman, or would they concede that only the U.S. could contain him? For Guzman himself, the prospect of extradition carried a unique dread. Mexico, for all its dangers, was familiar territory. He understood the system, its weaknesses, and its players. In the United States, there would be no tunnels, no bribes, no safe houses waiting in the mountains. There would only be concrete walls and steel doors designed for the sole purpose of making escape impossible. A U.S. prison sentence would not just end his freedom, it would bury his legend. As the months stretched on, Guzman's situation grew increasingly precarious. The Sinaloa Cartel continued to operate, but fractures deepened. His sons struggled to maintain authority, and rivals like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel pressed their advantage. For years, Guzman had been the face of Mexican organized crime, but now, locked away and isolated, he seemed less like a kingpin and more like a relic. Extradition loomed not just as a legal process, but as a symbolic transfer of power, signaling that his reign was truly ending. By 2016, court rulings steadily chipped away at his defenses. One by one, appeals were denied, and the path toward extradition became clearer. Behind the scenes, Mexican and American officials negotiated terms, balancing legal obligations with political considerations. Security measures were tightened even further as the transfer date approached. Officials feared that even in custody, Guzman might attempt one final escape, or that his allies might try to rescue him in transit. Finally, on 19 January 2017, just one day before Donald Trump's presidential inauguration, Mexico handed over Joaquín Guzmán to U.S. authorities. The timing was deliberate, a final gesture from Peña Nieto's administration to demonstrate cooperation with Washington. The transfer itself was carried out with extraordinary secrecy and precision. Under heavy guard, Guzmán was flown from Mexico to Long Island, New York, where he would face trial in the Eastern District Court. For El Chapo, the extradition was the moment his world truly collapsed. Stripped of influence, surrounded by agents who could not be bribed, and confined to a system with no cracks to exploit, he was finally beyond the reach of his old empire. The man who had once tunneled beneath prisons, who had vanished into mountains, who had defied the state at every turn, was now a prisoner of the United States, a system designed to ensure he would never walk free again. The extradition marked a turning point not only in Guzman's story but in the broader narrative of Mexico's war on drugs. To some, it was a victory, proof that even the most powerful cartel boss could not escape justice forever. To others, it was an admission of failure, a sign that Mexico could not contain its own criminals without outside help. And for Guzman, sitting in a foreign cell thousands of miles from home, it was the end of the myth of untouchability. Yet even in defeat, his legend endured. His extradition was covered by every major news outlet, dissected in documentaries, and immortalized in songs. Supporters still celebrated his cunning, while enemies quietly acknowledged the scale of his empire. The myth of El Chapo did not vanish on that January day, it simply shifted, moving from the mountains of Sinaloa to the sterile halls of American justice. In the end, extradition was not just a legal process. It was a symbolic severing, the final break between Guzman and the land that had birthed, protected, and elevated him. It marked the beginning of the last chapter in his saga, a trial that would lay bare the secrets of his empire and a sentence that would confine him for the rest of his days. For El Chapo, the escape artist who had once defied entire nations, there would be no tunnels, no shadows, no more second chances. The courtroom in Brooklyn, New York, was unlike any stage Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán had ever stood upon. For decades, his life had been a performance of power and cunning, played out in the shadows of mountains, tunnels, and blood-soaked battlefields. But here, beneath the seal of the United States, the performance was stripped bare. The walls were white, the seats orderly, the rules absolute. No loyal soldiers could storm these doors, no tunnels could carve beneath these foundations. This was not Mexico's justice system with its cracks and compromises, this was the United States Federal Court, a place built to crush men like Guzman. The trial began in November 2018, in the Eastern District Court of New York, presided over by Judge Brian Cogan. Security was unlike anything the courthouse had seen before. Snipers watched from rooftops. Roads were blocked whenever Guzman was transported. Armed convoys moved him from his cell to the courtroom, his every step shielded by heavily armed guards. Even inside the building, precautions were extraordinary. Jurors were kept anonymous and partially sequestered, protected from any potential influence or intimidation. For the government, keeping El Chapo alive and contained until a verdict was reached was just as important as convicting him. From the very beginning, the trial was designed to be airtight. Prosecutors laid out an overwhelming case, built from years of investigation, intelligence sharing, and the cooperation of Guzman's former allies. The charges stacked against him read like an encyclopedia of crime, drug trafficking on a scale almost unimaginable, money laundering worth billions, conspiracy to murder rivals, illegal possession of weapons, and leadership of a continuing criminal enterprise. Each charge carried years, sometimes decades, of prison time. Together, they amounted to a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The heart of the prosecution's strategy lay in its witnesses. Over the course of 3 months, more than 50 people testified, including some of Guzman's most trusted lieutenants. These were not small players, but high-ranking cartel members who had once sat at his table, shared his secrets, and carried out his orders. Men like Damso Lopez Nunes, known as El Licenciado, who had been a close ally before turning government witness. Others included former associates who managed shipments, coordinated assassinations, and handled the flow of billions in cash. Each voice peeled back another layer of the empire, painting a portrait of a man whose reach stretched from the mountains of Sinaloa to the streets of Chicago and New York. Their testimonies were devastating. They described how Guzmán oversaw the movement of cocaine through tunnels that burrowed beneath the U.S.-Mexico border, how he smuggled heroin hidden in jalapeno cans, how he relied on an army of assassins to enforce loyalty. They spoke of planes filled with drugs landing on clandestine runways, of shipments hidden in container ships and freight trains, of bribes paid in suitcases of cash to politicians, police, and prison guards. The scale was staggering. Prosecutors argued that Guzmán's cartel had moved more than 200 tons of cocaine into the United States and earned more than $14 billion in profits. Perhaps the most gripping testimony came not from faceless traffickers, but from those who had once been closest to him. One witness recounted how Guzmán ordered the torture and execution of rivals, describing the acts in chilling detail. Another spoke of meetings where millions of dollars in bribes were exchanged with Mexican officials, revealing the depth of corruption that shielded him for years. Even Guzmán's former mistress, Lucero Sanchez Lopez, testified, recalling how she once crawled through a hidden tunnel with him to escape capture, her voice trembling as she described their flight into the night. For the jury, the trial became a mosaic of fear, greed, and power, each piece placed carefully by the prosecution until the image was undeniable. Guzmán's lawyers, however, fought to dismantle this mosaic. Their defense was simple but bold. Guzmán was being made into a scapegoat. They argued that while he was a figure in the Sinaloa Cartel, he was not its true leader. Instead, they claimed, the cartel had been run by others, figures like Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who, unlike Guzmán, had never been captured and remained free. Their strategy was to cast doubt, to suggest that the government had captured the wrong kingpin, or at least exaggerated his role. But the sheer weight of evidence crushed these arguments. The government presented recordings of intercepted phone calls, text messages obtained from Guzmán's secret communications system, and even videos showing his involvement. One former IT specialist, who had once built secure networks for the cartel, testified that Guzmán himself had asked to spy on his own wife's phone, unwittingly giving law enforcement a backdoor into his empire's communications. Day after day, the trial revealed the contradictions that had always defined Guzmán. To his supporters in Sinaloa, he was a folk hero, a man who shared his wealth with the poor and stood against the powerful. But in the courtroom, stripped of myth, he was portrayed as ruthless, manipulative, and utterly consumed by control. He could be charming, smiling at his wife Emma Coronel in the audience, even blowing her a kiss. Yet those same days, witnesses recounted how he had ordered murders without hesitation, sometimes laughing as he gave the command. The trial itself became a media spectacle. Reporters from around the world packed the courtroom, scribbling notes as if documenting the fall of a myth. Outside, documentaries and books were already being prepared. For many, it was the trial of the century, not just because of Guzmán's notoriety, but because it revealed the machinery of a cartel that had shaped global drug trade for decades. The proceedings moved slowly but surely, each witness tightening the noose. By January 2019, after months of testimony, the case was handed to the jury. For 7 days they deliberated, shielded from the outside world, carrying the weight of history in their hands. When they returned, their decision was unanimous, guilty on all 10 counts. Guzmán sat still as the verdict was read, his face betraying little emotion. For a man who had once slipped through tunnels and bribed his way past justice, there would be no escape this time. The conviction carried with it the certainty of a life sentence. The world outside the courtroom reacted in waves, some celebrated, others mourned, and many simply marveled at the end of an era. The drug lord who had once humiliated entire governments was now condemned by a jury of ordinary citizens, his fate sealed by the very system he had spent his life defying. The trial was more than the prosecution of one man. It was a statement that even the most powerful criminals, those who seemed untouchable, could eventually be brought to justice. For Guzmán, it was the stripping away of the last illusions of control. His empire might continue, his name might live on in songs and stories, but his presence in that courtroom marked the moment when Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán became not a kingpin, but a convict. And yet, even in defeat, the shadow of his legend lingered. His story of rise, escape, and downfall was larger than the verdict itself. It was a reminder of the strange duality of El Chapo, the man who built tunnels beneath borders, who bribed presidents and generals, who commanded armies, and who now sat shackled beneath the sterile lights of an American courtroom. When the gavel fell and Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán's fate was sealed, the weight of justice came crashing down in a way even he could not have imagined. In July 2019, Judge Brian Cogan sentenced him to life in prison plus 30 years, along with an order to forfeit more than $12 billion in cartel profits. For a man who once commanded billions in assets, armies of loyal soldiers, and entire communities, the sentence represented not just punishment but erasure. His life would no longer be measured in power or riches, but in the quiet, unyielding monotony of confinement. The prison chosen for him was the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, better known as ADX Florence. This facility, often described as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, is the most secure prison in the United States, perhaps the world. It is designed for men considered too dangerous, too influential, or too likely to escape to be held anywhere else. Terrorists, spies, mafia bosses, and drug lords, here they are stripped of myth and locked in concrete silence. For Guzmán, a man who had defied walls and chains for decades, ADX was the final cage. His transfer to Florence was conducted under extraordinary security. Federal marshals moved him swiftly, under guard so tight that even his allies could not have dreamed of intervening. When he arrived, he was placed into a cell measuring just 7 by 12 feet. The walls were poured concrete, the bed a concrete slab with a thin mattress, the desk and stool bolted to the floor. A narrow window, only a few inches wide and angled toward the sky, offered a sliver of daylight but no view of the outside world. In this place, escape was not simply unlikely, it was impossible. Life inside ADX is structured to eliminate risk, both to staff and between inmates. Guzmán spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. His meals are slid through a slot in the steel door. When allowed outside, he is led in shackles to a small concrete enclosure nicknamed the Dog Run, where he can walk in circles for 1 hour under the open sky, surrounded by high fences and razor wire. He has no contact with the general prison population. His neighbors are other infamous figures, yet even they are voices muffled by walls and distance. For Guzmán, whose life had been defined by motion, planes, tunnels, convoys, escapes, the stillness of ADX is a punishment all its own. No more nights in the Sierra Madre Mountains, no more banquets surrounded by gunmen, no more whispered negotiations with corrupt officials. Instead, his days blend together into a cycle of silence and solitude. Letters, if allowed, are heavily monitored. Phone calls are rare and strictly controlled. Visits are restricted to immediate family, conducted under close surveillance. The man who once commanded thousands now finds himself speaking only to guards, lawyers, and, on rare occasion, his wife Emma Coronel before her own arrest. The psychological toll of ADX has long been debated. Inmates often describe it as a clean version of hell, a place where bodies survive but minds slowly unravel. Reports suggest that Guzman's mental state has suffered under these conditions. He has complained of headaches, memory lapses, and depression. Gone are the luxuries of his old life, replaced by fluorescent lights, endless silence, and the relentless ticking of time. The symbolism of his confinement cannot be overstated. Guzman's name had once been whispered with awe and fear from the streets of Culiacan to the barrios of Chicago. He was the escape artist, the kingpin who outsmarted governments, the man who made presidents tremble. Now he exists in a concrete box in the Colorado desert, invisible to the world he once ruled. For his enemies, it is vindication. For his supporters, it is tragedy. For governments, it is proof that even the most elusive criminal can eventually be caged. Yet even as he sits in silence, the shadow of his empire lingers. The Sinaloa Cartel did not collapse with his imprisonment. Under the leadership of his sons, the Chapitos, and longtime partner Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the cartel remains one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world. Guzman's absence changed its leadership, but not its reach. From his small cell in Colorado, El Chapo can only imagine the battles being fought in his name, the shifting alliances, the ongoing war with rivals like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. His power is gone, but his legacy still shapes the bloody landscape of Mexico's drug war. Inside ADX, daily routines replace ambition. He wakes at the same hour each morning, eats the same bland meals, and stares at the same concrete walls. Guards rotate, procedures repeat, and the monotony stretches endlessly forward. The man who once orchestrated billion-dollar deals and complex escapes now finds his only challenge is enduring the crushing boredom of solitude. Time, once a resource he manipulated with daring, is now his captor. Even in confinement, however, Guzman remains a figure of fascination. His trial, sentencing, and transfer to ADX continue to inspire documentaries, books, and even narco corridos, Mexican ballads that glorify drug lords. In popular culture, his name still carries the weight of legend. But the reality behind those songs and stories is stark. El Chapo's world has shrunk to a cell so small that he can stretch out his arms and nearly touch both walls. The contrast is haunting. Once, he dined with presidents, hid in mountain fortresses, and fled through tunnels that defied imagination. Now, he sits in silence, his empire reduced to memory and myth. His life sentence is not just the end of his freedom, it is the end of motion, the end of possibility, the end of El Chapo as the world once knew him. And yet, in a strange way, his confinement completes the myth. For the escape artist, the man who always found a way out, the story could only end in the one place from which there is no exit. The fortress of ADX Florence is not just his prison, it is his final stage, the place where Joaquín Guzmán's legend meets its immovable wall. Here, in this supermax cell, El Chapo lives out the remainder of his days, not as the kingpin of Sinaloa, not as the folk hero of narco corridors, not as the escape artist who defied nations, but as inmate number 89914-053, confined by steel and silence, his empire left to others, his myth preserved in the distance between what was and what is. The story of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán does not truly end with the clang of a prison door or the life sentence imposed in a U.S. courtroom. His physical journey may be finished, his body confined to the narrow walls of ADX Florence, but his legacy lingers like a shadow that refuses to be erased. Even as he disappears into the silence of solitary confinement, his name, his deeds, and the myth that grew around him continue to echo across borders, cultures, and generations. It is here, in the space between history and legend, that we find the final reflection on El Chapo, not just the man, but the symbol he became. In the dusty hills of Sinaloa, where his story began, Guzmán is remembered in two sharply different lights. To some, he was a benefactor, a man who handed out cash to struggling families, built infrastructure in rural towns, and offered protection to communities abandoned by the government. Stories abound of weddings he funded, school supplies he distributed, and jobs he created in regions where the state provided little more than neglect. For these voices, El Chapo is not a villain but a Robin Hood figure, a folk hero who stood against the system and lifted his people with him. But there is another memory, darker and harder to romanticize. For every story of generosity, there is another of violence. Guzmán's empire was built not just on clever smuggling and tunnels, but on blood. Rivals were executed, communities terrorized, journalists silenced. Families were shattered by addiction to the very drugs his cartel pumped across the border. His gifts to the poor came at a price paid in lives, both in Mexico and abroad. For these voices, his story is not a legend but a tragedy, a reminder of how power built on fear leaves scars that endure long after the man is gone. This duality defines Guzmán's legacy. He is both celebrated and condemned, remembered as a folk hero in narco corridors while denounced as a mass murderer in court transcripts. He is mythologized in Netflix series and documentaries, yet mourned as a source of destruction in the neighborhoods ravaged by his product. In this way, El Chapo's story mirrors that of many figures in the history of organized crime, larger than life, impossible to ignore, but deeply ambiguous when stripped of glamour. The fascination with his life stems not only from his deeds but from the contradictions he embodied. He was a poor farm boy who rose to become one of the richest men on earth. He was a fugitive who dined with politicians, a prisoner who twice vanished into freedom, a man feared for his cruelty but admired for his cunning. His escapes, especially, became central to his legend. Each time he slipped through the hands of authorities, the myth of El Chapo grew stronger, as if he were not just a man but a force of nature, something untouchable, inevitable, uncontainable. That myth outlived his captures, and in some ways, it still survives his imprisonment. Culturally, his story has been immortalized in ways few criminals ever achieve. Narco corridors sing of his exploits, blending fact with fiction in ballads that circulate from cantinas to Spotify playlists. Television series dramatize his life, giving him the aura of a tragic antihero. Books dissect his empire, while journalists and filmmakers attempt to separate truth from exaggeration. In every retelling, the legend grows, reshaped for each audience, each medium. Even his enemies cannot deny his place in history, for he reshaped the global drug trade in ways that will endure long after his death. Yet his story also stands as a mirror for the societies that produced and pursued him. El Chapo did not rise in a vacuum, he rose in a world where poverty, corruption, and inequality created fertile ground for cartels. His empire thrived because governments failed to provide opportunity, because demand for drugs in the United States remained insatiable, and because officials on both sides of the border were willing to take his money. In this sense, Guzman is not just a symbol of crime, but of systemic failure, a reminder that behind every kingpin lies a network of complicity and a market that sustains him. In his final years, confined in Colorado, El Chapo is stripped of all but his memories. His empire has been inherited by others, his wealth scattered, his freedom extinguished. Yet the man himself, sitting in silence, remains a living legend, if only because so many still tell his story. Children in Sinaloa hear his name whispered with awe. Scholars and journalists debate his impact. Artists retell his saga. And ordinary people, whether they view him as a hero or a villain, cannot forget him. That, perhaps, is the essence of legacy, not just what one does, but how one is remembered. What, then, does the legend of El Chapo teach us? It teaches that power built on violence can elevate a man to unimaginable heights but will always exact its cost. It shows that myth can outlive reality, that a man can become more than human in the eyes of those who tell his story. But it also teaches that even the mightiest are not immune to gravity. For every escape, there is a final capture. For every empire, there is an end. For every myth, there is a truth buried beneath the legend. In the end, Joaquín Guzmán's story is not simply one of crime. It is a tale of ambition, ingenuity, brutality, and inevitability. It is the story of a boy who dreamed of more, a man who defied nations, and a prisoner who sits alone in silence. His legend may inspire songs, series, and whispers in the mountains, but his reality is a life sentence with no escape. The escape artist who once tunneled through walls has found himself in a prison with no cracks to exploit. The man who outsmarted governments now waits in solitude for time to do what no rival, no army, no border could defeat him. And so, as the lights dim on his story, the world is left with a paradox. El Chapo, the man who seemed untouchable, is gone, yet El Chapo, the legend, lives on. He remains both a cautionary tale and a cultural myth, his life a mirror reflecting the power of ambition, the reach of violence, and the fragility of even the strongest empires. In the stillness of ADX Florence, Guzman fades into obscurity. In the songs, stories, and memories of those who knew his name, he will never truly disappear. This is the legacy of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, a man who rose from nothing, ruled through fear and cunning, defied capture with escapes that seemed impossible, and ended in a cell designed to silence him forever. A man who was both myth and reality, both admired and despised, both king and prisoner. His story is over, but his legend endures, whispered in corridors, studied in classrooms, debated in courtrooms, and remembered by all who lived in the shadow of his empire.